Hello. Today I'm going to take you to a place where you never thought you'd find answers beneath the waves. I'm standing in what used to be the operations room of Beacon Point Lighthouse, 30 miles off the Maine coast. The floorboards creak under my feet, and salt-stained windows filter the afternoon light into something that feels ancient, forgotten. On the desk before me lies a leather-bound logbook, its pages yellowed and warped from decades of ocean air. The final entry, dated October 15th, 19827, is written in the shaky handwriting of Thomas Whitmore, the lighthouse keeper who vanished 3 days after writing these words. Careful though, by the end, you might never see the ocean the same way again. The entry reads, Captain Morrison called again at 0300 hours. Same story. Lights beneath the water. Moving in formation. Coast Guard won't respond to his channel anymore. I've seen those lights myself now. God help us all. Below this, in different ink, as if added later, they're coming from Morrison. He knows too much about what's down there. So, before we dive into this deep story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if forgotten maritime truths and hidden oceanic memory gaps are your thing. And I'm curious, where are you watching from along the coast? What time is it there right now? Drop that in the comments, because I have a feeling some of you might recognize the phenomena I'm about to describe. Now, take a breath, listen to the waves, and let me unlock the stories that the ocean was never meant to keep secret. I turn the page, and there's a hand-drawn map of the waters around Beacon Point. Red X marks dot the ocean floor in a perfect grid pattern, each one labeled with a date and time. The dates span 3 months, from July through October 1987. At the bottom of the page, Whitmore has written, Morrison was right. The lights follow a schedule. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the water outside, automated now, but I can almost hear the ghost of Whitmore's footsteps pacing this same floor 37 years ago. He was the last person to believe Captain James Morrison before Morrison's ship, the Northern Star, disappeared on October 18th, 1987, taking with it a crew of 8 and the most detailed maritime log of underwater anomalies ever recorded. I run my fingers along the edge of the logbook, feeling the impressions left by Whitmore's desperate pen strokes. There's something about lighthouses that makes them natural repositories of truth. Their keepers are solitary witnesses to the sea's deepest secrets, watching from their towers as the ocean reveals what it hides from the rest of the world. The official Coast Guard report classified Morrison as mentally unstable, his sightings as hallucinations brought on by fatigue and isolation. But Whitmore's log tells a different story. It tells of a man who saw something the maritime authorities couldn't afford to acknowledge, something that would change shipping lanes and disrupt the carefully maintained fiction that our oceans are fully mapped and understood. I flip through more pages, finding radio transcripts that Whitmore meticulously copied by hand. Morrison's voice, filtered through static and desperation. Beacon Point. This is Northern Star. I have visual confirmation of submerged structures at coordinates 44 degrees 17 minutes north, 69 degrees 42 minutes west. Structures are illuminated. Repeat. Structures are illuminated. Please advise. Whitmore's response, logged in his careful script. Copy that. Northern Star. Structures confirmed from lighthouse position, requesting immediate Coast Guard investigation. But the Coast Guard never came. Instead, 3 days later, Morrison's radio license was suspended. A week after that, psychiatrists declared him unfit for maritime service. And 3 weeks after that, his ship vanished in calm seas under a clear sky. I closed the logbook and walked to the lighthouse window. The water below is deceptively peaceful, its surface reflecting the dying light like hammered silver. But I know now what Whitmore knew, what Morrison knew, that beneath this tranquil surface lies something the maritime establishment spent decades trying to bury. The lighthouse beam completes another rotation, and for just a moment, I swear I can see them. Faint geometric patterns of light, deep beneath the waves, exactly where Morrison's coordinates placed them. The same lights that cost him his career, his reputation, and ultimately his life. Some maritime historians believe that lighthouse keepers were the most reliable witnesses to oceanic anomalies because they had no financial interest in shipping routes or maritime commerce. They were simply there to watch, to warn, to bear witness. Whitmore bore witness to Morrison's truth. And like Morrison, he paid the price for refusing to stay silent. I think about the folk tales that coastal communities tell about lights beneath the water. Stories dismissed as sailors' superstition or alcohol-induced fantasies. But what if these stories weren't fantasies at all? What if they were the collective memory of something real? Something that maritime authorities have been suppressing for generations. The wind picks up outside, and I can hear the waves below crashing against the lighthouse's stone foundation. It's a sound that's been constant for over a century, a rhythmic reminder that the ocean keeps its own time, holds its own secrets, and remembers everything we choose to forget. I'm leaving Beacon Point now, but I'm taking Whitmore's logbook with me. It's the first piece of evidence in a puzzle that will take me from the fog-shrouded coasts of Maine to the highest levels of maritime authority, from the whispered confessions of retired sailors to the classified files of naval research stations. Captain Morrison was called crazy because he saw lights that weren't supposed to exist. But as I'm about to show you, the lights were real, the structures were real, and the conspiracy to silence him was even more real than the mysteries he died trying to expose. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the water one more time as I walk away, and I wonder if somewhere in the depths below, those lights are still burning, still waiting for someone brave enough to acknowledge what the ocean has been trying to tell us all along. The Portland Maritime archives smell of old paper and forgotten promises. I'm sitting at a wooden table that's probably older than the building itself, surrounded by filing cabinets that stretch from floor to ceiling, like monuments to maritime bureaucracy. In my hands is Captain James Morrison's original incident report, dated July 23rd, 1987, 3 months before his disappearance, 3 months before the Coast Guard declared him mentally unfit. The report is typed on official letterhead, every word carefully chosen, every detail methodically recorded. Morrison knew that what he was documenting would sound impossible, so he approached it like the 20-year veteran mariner he was, with facts, coordinates, and the kind of procedural language that maritime authorities couldn't easily dismiss. At 23:47 hours on July 22nd, 1987, while conducting routine cargo transport from Boston to Halifax, I observed unusual illumination patterns approximately 200 feet below surface level at coordinates 44 degrees 17 minutes north, 69 degrees 42 minutes west. The illumination appeared geometric in nature, consisting of parallel lines of white light extending roughly 500 yards in length. I pause, letting the weight of those words settle. Morrison wasn't reporting sea monsters or ghost ships. He was reporting lights, methodical, geometric, purposeful lights, where no lights should exist. The kind of lights that suggest something constructed, something intentional. His description continues with the precision of a man who knows his credibility depends on every detail. Duration of observation, 47 minutes. Weather conditions, clear. Visibility, 8+ miles. Seas 2 to 3 feet. No other vessels in immediate vicinity. Underwater illumination maintained consistent brightness and pattern throughout observation period. I flipped through the pages, finding Morrison's hand-drawn sketches of what he saw. The drawings are crude, but clear. Straight lines of light, arranged in a grid pattern, with notations indicating depth and approximate dimensions. At the bottom of one sketch, he's written, "Lights did not move randomly." Pattern suggests infrastructure. Infrastructure, that's the word that would eventually destroy Morrison's career. Because infrastructure implies intention, planning, construction, and, according to every maritime chart, geological survey, and oceanographic study, there is no infrastructure at those coordinates. The ocean floor there is supposed to be empty sand and scattered rocks, 400 feet down in the Stellwagen Bank Marine Sanctuary. I remember that logbook from the lighthouse, don't I? Whitmore's desperate handwriting confirming Morrison's coordinates. 2 independent witnesses seeing the same impossible thing in the same impossible place. But in July of 1987, Morrison was still alone with his sighting, still believing that the proper channels would take him seriously. The file contains Morrison's formal request for a Coast Guard investigation, submitted 3 days after his initial report. The language is respectful but insistent. Given the potential navigation hazard posed by uncharted underwater structures, I respectfully request immediate sonar investigation of the reported coordinates. Navigation hazard. Morrison was trying to give them an out. A reason to investigate that had nothing to do with the lights themselves. He understood that maritime authorities cared more about shipping safety than unexplained phenomena, but even this diplomatic approach would prove futile. I turned to the next document. The Coast Guard's response, dated August 15th, 1987. 3 weeks of silence, then a form letter. After review of your July 23rd incident report, no evidence of navigation hazards has been identified at the specified coordinates. Current charts and sonar data indicate normal ocean floor topography. No further action required. No further action required. 4 words that would haunt Morrison for the remaining months of his life. 4 words that told him the Coast Guard had no intention of investigating what he'd seen. No interest in confirming or denying his report with actual evidence. But Morrison wasn't ready to give up. I find his follow-up letter, dated August 20th, handwritten this time, the formality of his earlier correspondence giving way to something more personal, more disparate. I've been sailing these waters for 20 years. I know the difference between bioluminescence and artificial light. What I saw was constructed, purposeful, and it's still down there. The response to this letter is even more dismissive. A single paragraph suggesting Morrison consider the effects of fatigue and extended time at sea on his perception of natural phenomena. Reading between the lines, they were already building the case for his mental unfitness, already laying the groundwork to discredit anything else he might report. Some maritime historians believe that the Coast Guard's quick dismissal of Morrison's report was actually evidence of prior knowledge. The theory goes that maritime authorities had already documented similar phenomena, but classified the information to prevent panic among commercial shipping interests. Morrison's public report threatened to expose something they'd been keeping secret for years. The folk tales of the Maine coast are full of stories about the lights below, fishermen's stories passed down through generations about geometric patterns of light that appear beneath their boats on clear nights. Most academics dismiss these as variations of will-o'-the-wisp legends, natural phenomena misinterpreted by superstitious sailors. But what if the superstitious sailors were actually the most reliable witnesses? What if they saw what Morrison saw, generation after generation, but never had the maritime credentials to make it official? I close Morrison's file and sit back in the archive's fluorescent silence. Outside, I can hear the distant sound of Portland Harbor, container ships, fishing boats, pleasure craft going about their business in waters that might hold secrets deeper than any of them realize. Morrison made 4 more sighting reports between August and October of 1987, each one more detailed than the last. Each one met with increasing hostility from maritime authorities. By September, his reports weren't even being acknowledged. By October, he was being ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation. The last document in Morrison's file is a handwritten note dated October 16th, 1987, 2 days before his disappearance. It's not an official report, just a personal memo he apparently submitted to keep some record of his final observations. The lights are getting brighter, more frequent. Something's changing down there. I'm gonna get proof this time, even if it kills me. Even if it kills me. Words that now read like prophecy, like the final entry in a logbook that would never be completed. I gather the documents, but I can't shake the feeling that Morrison's story isn't just about one man's struggle to be believed. It's about the ocean's capacity to reveal truths that our institutions aren't equipped to handle, secrets that challenge everything we think we know about what lies beneath the waves. As I leave the archives, the afternoon sun reflecting off Portland Harbor's surface, I wonder how many other mariners have seen Morrison's lights. How many others have filed reports that disappeared into filing cabinets, their credibility destroyed by a system that values stable shipping lanes more than inconvenient truths. Morrison's first sighting report was just the beginning, but already, reading his careful words and precise sketches, I can see the trajectory that would lead from professional curiosity to personal obsession to ultimate tragedy. The ocean had shown him something extraordinary, and he made the fatal mistake of believing that someone in authority might actually want to know what it was. The nursing home in Bar Harbor smells of disinfectant and unfinished stories. I'm sitting across from Eddie Kowalski, 83 years old, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that stopped steaming an hour ago. Eddie was Morrison's first mate on the Northern Star, one of only 2 crew members who survived that final voyage. Survived because they jumped ship in Boston 2 days before Morrison's last departure. Nobody ever asked me what I saw. Eddie tells me, his voice barely above a whisper. Coast Guard came around after Jimmy disappeared, but they weren't interested in testimony. They just wanted to know if he'd been acting strange, drinking too much, talking to himself. They had their story already written. Eddie's eyes drift to the window, overlooking Frenchman Bay, where pleasure boats dot the water like scattered thoughts. His fingers trace the rim of his cup, and I can see he's somewhere else, somewhere 37 years in the past, standing on the deck of a cargo ship, watching impossible lights dance beneath the waves. First time I saw them lights was in August. He continues, Jimmy called us all topside around midnight. There they were, bright as Christmas, laid out in perfect rows, like someone had dropped a city grid down there. We watched for maybe an hour, none of us saying much. What do you say about something like that? I lean forward, careful not to break the spell of memory. Did anyone else on the crew report what they saw? Eddie shakes his head slowly. Jimmy told us to keep quiet until he figured out how to handle it proper. He was worried about our licenses, or livelihoods. Maritime authorities don't like crews that see things that ain't supposed to be there. The official record shows that the Northern Star carried a crew of 8 that summer. Morrison, Eddie, second mate Tommy Rodriguez, engineer Frank Bellecourt, and 4 deckhands. After Morrison's disappearance, investigators interviewed only Morrison's wife and the harbor master who'd seen the ship leave port. The crew, the actual witnesses to Morrison's impossible sightings, were never formally questioned. Tommy Rodriguez, he drew pictures. Eddie remembers, had this little sketchbook, always drawing the rigging, the harbor, whatever caught his eye. After that first night with the lights, he started drawing what we saw down there, detailed pictures, like architectural drawings. Morrison kept asking to see them, studying them like they might tell him something. I ask Eddie what happened to Rodriguez's sketchbook. His face darkens. Tommy died in a fishing accident 6 months after Jimmy disappeared. Boat explosion in Halifax Harbor. His gear went down with him, including that sketchbook. Funny thing though, Tommy was the most careful engineer I ever sailed with. I never saw him make a mistake with fuel lines or electrical systems. But accidents happen. Right. The coincidence sends a chill through me. Morrison disappears in October 1987. Rodriguez dies in April 1988. 2 men who documented the underwater lights, both dead within 6 months. I ask Eddie about the other crew members. Frank Bellecourt moved to Florida right after Jimmy disappeared. Said he was done with cold water sailing. Lost touch with him years ago. The deckhands scattered too. Couple of them left maritime work altogether. It's like that whole crew just dissolved. Eddie stars into his cold coffee, and I can see the weight of 37 years pressing down on him. He's the last living witness to what Morrison saw, the last person who can confirm that the captain wasn't hallucinating or fabricating his reports. You want to know the real reason I jumped ship? Eddie asks suddenly. It wasn't the lights. We'd gotten used to the lights by then. Strange as that sounds, it was what Jimmy started saying about them. How they were getting brighter, more active. How they seemed to be responding to our presence. Responding, that's a word that appears nowhere in Morrison's official reports, but it opens up possibilities that are far more unsettling than static underwater illumination. If the lights were responsive, it suggested intelligence, and if there was intelligence beneath those waters, it meant Morrison wasn't just observing, he was being observed in return. Some maritime historians believe that crew testimony is the most reliable form of evidence for oceanic anomalies because sailors have no incentive to fabricate stories that could cost them their careers. But in Morrison's case, the crew's testimony was never collected, never preserved, never entered into any official record. The folk tradition of sailor silence runs deep in maritime culture. The understanding that some things seen at sea are better left unreported. Crews learn early that challenging official narratives leads to unemployment, that describing impossible phenomena marks you as unreliable. Morrison's crew understood this, which is why they stayed quiet when investigators came around. The night before I left the ship, Eddie continues. Jimmy showed me his personal log, not the official one. He kept 2 sets of books by then. The personal log had everything: coordinates, times, sketches, theories about what might be down there. He was obsessed, staying up all night watching the water, taking measurements, trying to figure out patterns. I asked if Morrison ever found patterns in the light's behavior. Oh yeah, he found patterns all right. Said they followed lunar cycles, appeared strongest during new moons. Said they seemed to track shipping routes, getting more active when vessels passed overhead. But the thing that really spooked him was how they started responding to radio transmissions. Radio transmissions. Another detail that never made it into Morrison's official reports. Another piece of evidence that his superiors would have dismissed as fantasy. But to Eddie, sitting in his nursing home chair with the weight of decades on his shoulders, it's just another truth he's carried alone for far too long. Jimmy would test it. Eddie whispers. He'd key his radio mic, just hold it down for a few seconds, and the lights would pulse, like they were answering back. Made my skin crawl. I tell you, that's when I knew I had to get off that ship. I sit in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications. Morrison wasn't just passively observing the lights, he was actively communicating with them. And whatever was down there was communicating back. Last thing Jimmy told me, Eddie says, was that he was going to get proof. Said the Coast Guard could ignore his reports, but they couldn't ignore physical evidence. He was planning to dive down there himself, get video footage, maybe bring up samples. The room falls quiet, except for the distant sound of waves against the harbor seawall. Eddie's testimony fills in gaps that Morrison's reports only hinted at. The progressive nature of his observations, the responsive behavior of the lights, the captain's growing determination to prove what he'd seen. But Eddie's words also confirm something darker, that Morrison's crew was systematically excluded from the official investigation. Their testimony buried along with any evidence that might have supported Morrison's claims. The conspiracy to silence Morrison began even before his disappearance, ensuring that when he vanished, there would be no credible witnesses left to challenge the official narrative of mental instability. You know what haunts me most? Eddie asks as I prepare to leave. Sometimes, on clear nights, when I can see the water from my window, I still look for them lights. Part of me hopes they're still down there. Part of me hopes they're not. I shake Eddie's hand and promise to tell his story. As I walk through the nursing home corridors, past residents who've forgotten more than they remember, I realize that Eddie Kowalski is more than just a witness. He's a keeper of maritime memory, preserving truths that official channels were determined to erase. The crew's missing testimonies aren't just gaps in the historical record. They're evidence of systematic suppression, proof that Morrison's case was handled not as an investigation but as a cover-up. And somewhere in the dark waters off Maine, the lights that destroyed a captain's reputation and scattered his crew continue to burn, waiting for someone brave enough to dive deep enough to bring back proof. The Coast Guard Station's South Portland archive room is colder than I expected, fluorescent lights humming overhead like electronic insects. I'm holding 2 logbooks, Morrison's official ship's log from the Northern Star and the Coast Guard's incident report from October 18th, 1987. They're supposed to tell the same story. They don't. Morrison's final official entry, dated October 17th, reads like standard maritime protocol. Weather clear. Seas 2 to 3 feet. Cargo sicuri. On schedule for Halifax arrival. 800 hours. October 19th. All crew accounted for. No mechanical issues reported. It's the kind of entry that any cargo captain might write on any routine voyage. Professional, concise, unremarkable. But the Coast Guard report tells a different story entirely. According to their investigation, Morrison's final radio contact describes severe weather conditions and equipment failure. The report states that Morrison transmitted a distress signal at 03:47 hours on October 18th, reporting taking on water in heavy seas before radio contact was lost. I read both documents again, checking dates, times, coordinates. There's no way to reconcile these accounts. Morrison's log shows a calm, routine voyage. The Coast Guard report describes a maritime emergency that Morrison apparently never bothered to record in his official log. Either Morrison was lying in his final entries, or the Coast Guard was lying in the report. I remember Eddie Kowalski's weathered hands wrapped around that coffee cup. His whispered confession about Morrison keeping 2 sets of books, the official log, designed for Coast Guard inspection, and the personal log, where Morrison recorded what he really saw, what he really believed was happening beneath his ship. The archive clerk, a thin woman named Margaret, who's worked here for 30 years, notices my confusion, finding discrepancies. She asks, with the weary tone of someone who's seen too many inconsistencies in official maritime records, "The weather reports don't match." I tell her, Morrison's log shows clear conditions, but the Coast Guard report describes a storm. Margaret nods, knowingly. October 18th, 1987. I remember that case. Weather stations from here to Nova Scotia recorded clear skies. That entire week, no storm systems, no unusual wave activity. But the official report insisted on severe weather. She pulls out a meteorological file, pages of data from weather stations along the shipping route Morrison was following, bar graphs and numerical readings that confirm what Morrison wrote in his log. Calm seas, clear skies, perfect sailing conditions. The kind of weather that makes ship disappearances impossible to explain through natural causes. Why would the Coast Guard fabricate a storm? I ask. Margaret's expression grows guarded. People disappear at sea for lots of reasons. Storms are easier to explain than other possibilities. Other possibilities. The phrase hangs in the air like fog, heavy with implications. Margaret has worked maritime archives for 3 decades. She's seen enough unexplained disappearances to know that official explanations don't always match physical evidence. I flip through Morrison's log, looking for any signs of the mental instability that authorities would later claim caused his disappearance. His handwriting remains steady throughout. His entries methodical and precise. Even his final entry, written just hours before he vanished, shows no signs of distress or erratic behavior. But then I find something that makes my blood run cold. A entry that's been carefully whited out, the correction fluid applied so thoroughly that no trace of the original text shows through. The date stamp reads October 16th, but whatever Morrison wrote that day has been completely erased. Margaret, I call over. Who would have access to Morrison's log after his disappearance? She consults a sign-out sheet from 1987, Coast Guard investigators, insurance adjusters, and, she pauses, representatives from Meridian Maritime Consulting. Meridian Maritime Consulting. The name means nothing to me, but Margaret's tone suggests it should. I ask her to explain. Private maritime security firm, she says carefully. They investigate incidents that might affect commercial shipping interests. Insurance companies hire them when standard investigations might uncover complications. Complications. Another euphemism. Another way of describing truths that maritime authorities prefer to keep buried. I ask Margaret if Meridian had any other involvement in Morrison's case. They were here for 3 days in November 1987. She tells me, consulting her records, reviewed all the documentation, took copies of everything. Their representative specifically requested access to Morrison's personal effects. Personal effects? Morrison's personal log. The one Eddie mentioned. The one where Morrison recorded what he really saw beneath the waves. If Meridian Maritime Consulting removed that log, it would explain the glaring inconsistencies between Morrison's official entries and the Coast Guard's account of his final voyage. Some maritime historians believe that private consulting firms like Meridian serve as buffers between maritime authorities and commercial shipping interests. When incidents threaten to disrupt profitable shipping routes or challenge accepted navigation protocols, these firms ensure that investigations reach conclusions that protect economic interests rather than uncover inconvenient truths. The folk wisdom of coastal communities includes warnings about the companies that clean up messes. Fishing families speak in whispers about investigators who arrive after unexplained incidents, who ensure that witness testimony disappears and physical evidence gets misfiled. Morrison's case shows all the hallmarks of such intervention. I examine the whited-out entry more closely, holding the page up to the archive's harsh fluorescent lighting. Sometimes, with old correction fluid, you can make out traces of the original text by looking at the indentations left by the pen pressure. After several minutes of careful examination, I can make out fragments, lights responding to, and depth charges from, and what might be naval presence confirmed. Naval presence. That's a detail that appears nowhere in any official account of Morrison's disappearance. According to every report, Morrison was alone on the shipping route when he vanished. But if his personal log mentioned naval vessels in the area, it suggests a much more complex scenario than a simple merchant ship lost in a storm that never existed. I photographed the whited-out page with my phone, adjusting angles and lighting to capture any visible text impressions. Modern photo enhancement might be able to recover more of Morrison's erased words, more pieces of the puzzle that someone worked very hard to destroy. Margaret watches me work with the expression of someone who's seen too many people chase ghosts through maritime archives. You might want to be careful, she says quietly. People who dig too deep into certain cases sometimes find that their own documentation starts going missing. Her warning carries the weight of experience, the understanding that maritime bureaucracies have ways of protecting themselves from inconvenient investigators. But I'm too deep into Morrison's story to turn back now, too invested in uncovering the truth that someone spent considerable effort to bury. The contradiction between Morrison's log and the Coast Guard report isn't just an administrative error, it's evidence of systematic deception. Someone wanted Morrison's disappearance explained by natural causes, even if it meant fabricating weather conditions and erasing entries that might suggest other explanations. As I prepare to leave the archive, Margaret hands me a business card with a handwritten note on the back. Try the Meridian files, but don't use my name. The card belongs to someone at the National Archives in Washington, someone who might have access to maritime consulting records that never made it into official Coast Guard files. I walk out of the archive into the Maine afternoon, Morrison's contradictory logbook tucked under my arm like evidence of a crime that hasn't been prosecuted yet. The discrepancies between his final entries and the official investigation aren't just gaps in the record. They're proof that Morrison's story was being rewritten even as he was living it. The ship's log contradiction reveals something darker than simple bureaucratic incompetence. It shows that Morrison's disappearance was being managed, his story being shaped to fit a narrative that protected interests more powerful than one cargo captain's pursuit of underwater truth. But Morrison's erased words, hidden beneath layers of correction fluid, continue to whisper their secrets. And somewhere in the archives of Meridian Maritime Consulting, his personal log might still exist, containing the complete account of what he saw in those final days before the lights beneath the sea claimed him forever. The Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution rises from the Massachusetts coastline like a temple to the sea's mysteries. I'm sitting in Dr. Elena Vasquez's office, surrounded by charts of ocean currents and photographs of deep-sea creatures that look more alien than earthly. Dr. Vasquez is a marine geophysicist who spent 20 years studying bioluminescence in the North Atlantic, and she's the first scientist willing to discuss Morrison's sightings without immediately dismissing them as hallucinations. Geometric patterns of light at depth, she muses, studying Morrison's coordinates on her computer screen. It's not impossible. We've documented similar phenomena in the Monterey Canyon, though nothing quite so organized. Dr. Vasquez pulls up bathymetric data from the Stellwagen Bank area where Morrison reported his sightings. The ocean floor appears on her screen in false color relief, showing the underwater topography in precise detail, but instead of the flat, featureless bottom that official charts describe, her data reveals something far more interesting. Look at this, she says, pointing to a series of regular depressions in the seafloor. These formations weren't in the original surveys from the 1970s. They appear to have developed sometime in the 1980s, right around the time of your captain's reports. The formations are artificial looking, too regular to be natural. They form a grid pattern, roughly 500 yards across, the same dimensions Morrison described for his underwater lights. Each depression is approximately rectangular, as if something had been placed there and then removed, leaving impressions in the seafloor sediment. What could create formations like this? I ask. Dr. Vasquez hesitatis, her scientific training warring with what the evidence suggests. Theoretically, temporary installations, research equipment, monitoring stations, possibly military hardware. The depressions indicate heavy objects that were anchored to the seafloor for an extended period, then removed. Temporary installations. The phrase echoes Morrison's description of lights that appeared and disappeared on a schedule, following patterns that suggested purpose rather than random natural phenomena. If Dr. Vasquez is right, Morrison wasn't observing some unknown sea creature or geological anomaly. He was witnessing human activity that someone wanted to keep secret. I remember that logbook from Whitmore's lighthouse, the hand-drawn map with red X marks showing Morrison's light sightings. If I overlay that map with Dr. Vasquez's bathymetric data, the correlation is unmistakable. Every light sighting corresponds to one of the unexplained seafloor formations. Have you seen similar installations elsewhere? I ask. Dr. Vasquez nods reluctantly. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet navies deployed extensive underwater monitoring networks, sound detection arrays, submarine tracking systems, experimental technology platforms. Most were classified, and many installations were temporary, deployed for specific missions, then removed when the missions were complete. She shows me photographs from a 1990 research expedition that discovered abandoned underwater structures off the coast of Iceland. The images show geometric metal frameworks, partially buried in seafloor sediment, cables leading to equipment pods that had been stripped of their electronic components. The installations had clearly been sophisticated, but whoever built them had made significant efforts to remove all identifying information. The timing of Morrison's sightings is significant. Dr. Vasquez continues. 1987 was a crucial year in Cold War submarine warfare. The U.S. Navy was testing new detection technologies, trying to track Soviet submarines that were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Temporary installations in strategic locations would have been a logical approach. But this raises uncomfortable questions about Morrison's treatment by maritime authorities. If his sightings documented legitimate military operations, why wasn't he simply told that the area was classified and off-limits? Why the elaborate cover-up, the psychiatric evaluations, the systematic destruction of his credibility? Some maritime historians believe that Morrison's case represents a collision between military secrecy and civilian maritime traffic. The theory suggests that Morrison inadvertently documented classified operations and that military authorities chose to destroy his credibility rather than risk exposing the installations he'd observed. The folk traditions of submarine warfare include stories about ghost installations, temporary underwater bases that appeared and disappeared like phantoms, leaving only traces in the seafloor sediment and the memories of civilian sailors who happened to see more than they were supposed to see. Morrison's lights might have been one of these ghost installations, made visible by their operational lighting during the brief period they were active. Dr. Vasquez pulls up another screen showing bioluminescence patterns from the same area. Natural bioluminescence is random, organic, unpredictable. She explains what Morrison described: geometric patterns, consistent timing, responsive behavior. That's not how sea life produces light. She shows me video footage of actual bioluminescent phenomena, the chaotic swirling of disturbed plankton, the random flashing of deep-sea jellyfish, the organic pulses of bacterial colonies. None of it resembles Morrison's careful descriptions of parallel lines and grid patterns. The responsiveness to radio transmissions is particularly telling. Dr. Vasquez adds, no known marine organism reacts to electromagnetic radiation in the way Morrison described, but electronic monitoring equipment, that would absolutely respond to radio signals. I think about Eddie Kowalski's testimony. His description of Morrison testing the light's responsiveness by keying his radio mic. If the lights were part of a classified installation, Morrison's radio transmissions might have triggered automated responses, acknowledgement signals or status indicators that revealed the electronic nature of what he was observing. Is there any way to confirm whether military installations were operating in that area during 1987? I ask. Dr. Vasquez's expression grows cautious. Official military records from that period remain classified, but there are unofficial sources, retired naval personnel who remember operations they're not supposed to talk about, research contractors who worked on classified projects and are now willing to discuss them off the record. She writes a name and phone number on a piece of paper, sliding it across her desk like contraband. Dr. James Whitfield, formerly of Naval Underwater Systems Center. He retired in 1995 and has been cyber lead in 1995. Vocal about the need for transparency regarding Cold War-era naval operations, he might be willing to discuss installations that are no longer operationally sensitive, As I prepare to leave Woods Hole, Dr. Vasquez makes one final observation that sends chills through me. If Morrison was observing classified installations, his disappearance makes sense from a security perspective. People who compromise military operations, even accidentally, sometimes need to be removed from the equation. Removed from the equation, the clinical language doesn't disguise the darker implications. That Morrison might have been eliminated, not because he was mentally unstable, but because he was documenting activities that powerful interests needed to keep secret. I walk along the Woods Hole waterfront, watching research vessels prepare for deep-sea expeditions. The ocean stretches to the horizon, its surface concealing whatever secrets lie beneath. But Dr. Vasquez's data has transformed Morrison's impossible sightings into something far more plausible and far more threatening. The underwater lights weren't supernatural phenomena or hallucinations. They were evidence of classified military operations that Morrison wasn't supposed to see. His careful documentation of geometric patterns, responsive behavior, and scheduled appearances had inadvertently exposed secret installations that someone was willing to kill to protect. The bathymetric evidence proves that something was installed on the seafloor during the 1980s, something substantial enough to leave permanent impressions in the sediment. Morrison's lights weren't fantasies. They were real. They were classified, and they cost him everything when he refused to pretend he hadn't seen them. But the installations are gone now, removed as quietly as they were deployed, leaving only traces in the geological record and the fragmented memories of a cargo captain who dared to report what he observed. The lights that destroyed Morrison's life have been extinguished, but their shadows still fall across anyone brave enough to investigate what really happened in those dark waters off the Maine coast. The phone booth outside the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard is one of the last working payphones in New England, a relic from an era when sensitive conversations required analog anonymity. I'm using it to call Dr. James Whitfield, the retired naval engineer whose number Dr. Vasquez passed me like classified intelligence. The irony isn't lost on me. Investigating a naval cover-up from 1987 using technology from the same decade. Morrison. Dr. Whitfield's voice crackles through the old receiver. Yeah, I remember that case. Not officially, you understand? But word gets around in the underwater systems community. Captain who saw things he wasn't supposed to see. Dr. Whitfield agrees to meet me at a diner in Kittery, 30 minutes from the shipyard. When I arrive, he's already there. A thin man in his 70s, with the careful posture of someone who's spent his career keeping secrets. His hands are stained with what looks like engine grease, but I realize it's just the permanent discoloration that comes from a lifetime working with electronic components. You want to know about the installations, he says without preamble. Project Deepwatch. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was the most sophisticated underwater surveillance network ever deployed. Project Deepwatch. The name appears in none of the maritime documents I've examined, none of the Coast Guard reports or insurance investigations, but Dr. Whitfield speaks it with the certainty of someone who helped design whatever Morrison stumbled upon in those dark waters off Maine. The Soviets were getting too good at submarine stealth. Dr. Whitfield explains, stirring sugar into coffee that's gone cold. Their newer boats could slip past our traditional sonar networks, like ghosts. We needed something more advanced, more flexible. He pulls out a napkin and starts sketching, his engineer's mind automatically translating concepts into diagrams. The sketch shows a grid of underwater platforms connected by cables, each platform equipped with sensors, lights, and communication equipment. Temporary installations. He continues, we deploy them for 6-month periods, gather intelligence on Soviet submarine routes, then remove them before anyone noticed. The platforms were designed to be invisible from the surface during daylight, but they required operational lighting for maintenance and data transmission. Operational lighting. Morrison's geometric patterns of light suddenly make perfect sense. Not alien technology or unknown sea life, but mundane military engineering visible to anyone observant enough to look down instead of ahead. Morrison's coordinates put him right over installation Bravo 7, Dr. Whitfield says, consulting a small notebook he produces from his jacket. That platform was active from July through October 1987. Exactly when Morrison was reporting his sightings, The timing is too precise to be coincidental. Morrison's first report in July corresponded to the installation's deployment. His increasing number of sightings throughout the summer matched the platform's operational schedule. His disappearance in October came just weeks before the installation was scheduled for removal. What was the official protocol when civilians observed the installations? I ask. Dr. Whitfield's expression grows troubled. There wasn't supposed to be an official protocol because civilians weren't supposed to observe anything. The installations were designed to operate below normal shipping depths, invisible to surface traffic. Morrison's reports were unexpected. Unexpected. The word carries implications that make my skin crawl. Morrison wasn't just an inconvenient witness. He was a security breach that military planners hadn't anticipated. His detailed reports, his persistent communication with maritime authorities, his refusal to accept dismissive explanations had turned him from an accidental observer into a potential threat to national security. How did naval intelligence respond to Morrison's reports? I ask. Dr. Whitfield stares into his coffee cup as if reading tea leaves. There were meetings. Lots of meetings. The Navy couldn't acknowledge the installations without compromising the entire Deepwatch program, but they couldn't let Morrison keep documenting our operations either. He describes a series of classified conferences held in Washington during August and September 1987. Meetings that included representatives from naval intelligence, the Coast Guard, and what he calls civilian contractors. The same euphemism Margaret used for Meridian Maritime Consulting. The decision was made to discredit Morrison rather than relocate the installation. Dr. Whitfield reveals, moving Bravo 7 would have compromised 6 months of Soviet submarine tracking data. Morrison was considered expendable. Expendable. The clinical terminology doesn't disguise the human cost of that decision. Morrison's career, his reputation, his life, all sacrificed to protect a surveillance operation that would be classified for decades. Some maritime historians believe that the Cold War created a parallel system of maritime governance where military priorities superseded civilian authority and national security concerns justified the elimination of inconvenient witnesses. Morrison's case represents a collision between these two systems, with predictable results for the civilian caught in the middle. The folk memory of coastal communities includes whispered stories about the men in suits who appeared after unusual maritime incidents. Local officials would receive visits from federal representatives who explained the importance of national security and the dangers of allowing rumors to spread about sensitive military operations. Morrison's case shows how this system operated when quiet intimidation failed to silence an inconvenient witness. The psychological evaluation was the first step. Dr. Whitfield continues, standard procedure for discrediting civilian observers. You establish a pattern of mental instability, question their credibility, suggest that stress and isolation have affected their judgment. He describes the process with the detached precision of someone who'd witnessed it before. The careful documentation of personality quirks, the emphasis on Morrison's isolated work environment, the suggestions that extended time at sea had affected his perception of reality. Morrison fought back harder than expected. Dr. Whitfield admits, most civilians accept the psychiatric narrative and fade away quietly. Morrison kept pushing, kept demanding investigations, kept producing evidence. He forced us to escalate. Escalation, another euphemism that carries darker implications. If psychological discrediting failed to silence Morrison, what came next in the protocol for protecting classified installations? What happened on October 18th? I asked directly. Dr. Whitfield's hands pause in their sketching, and for a long moment, the only sound in the diner is the hiss of coffee machines and the distant rumble of traffic. When he finally speaks, his voice carries the weight of secrets held too long. Installation, Bravo 7, was equipped with defensive capabilities. He says carefully, if the platform detected security threats, unauthorized approaches, surveillance attempt, documentation efforts, it could respond autonomously. Autonomous response. The phrase sends ice through my veins. Morrison wasn't just a witness to classified military installations. He was targeted by them. His final voyage, his decision to gather physical proof of what he'd observed, had triggered defensive systems designed to protect naval secrets at any cost. Morrison's ship was detected approaching the installation coordinates at 0347 hours on October 18th. Dr. Whitfield reveals platform sensors registered unauthorized diving equipment aboard the vessel. The system classified Morrison as a hostile intelligence asset and activated countermeasures. I don't need Dr. Whitfield to explain what that means. Morrison's determination to prove what he'd seen had signed his own death warrant, triggering automated defenses that eliminated threats to national security without requiring human authorization or oversight. The cover-up hadn't begun after Morrison's disappearance. It had begun months earlier, when his first reports reached the attention of military planners who valued surveillance data more than civilian lives. His psychological evaluation, the dismissal of his crew's testimony, the fabrication of storm conditions in his final Coast Guard report, all part of a systematic effort to bury not just Morrison's observations, but Morrison himself. As I leave the diner, Dr. Whitfield's parting words echo in my mind. Morrison was right about everything he saw. That's what made him so dangerous. The cover-up of Morrison's case wasn't motivated by embarrassment or bureaucratic incompetence. It was a military operation designed to protect classified installations by eliminating the civilian who discovered them. Morrison's impossible lights were real. His documentation was accurate, and his persistence in seeking the truth had marked him for elimination by the very systems he was trying to expose. The basement of the Federal Communications Commission building in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, houses radio archives that most people don't know exist. I'm following Harold Brennan, a retired FCC technician who spent 40 years monitoring maritime radio frequencies through corridors lined with boxes of magnetic tape recordings. Every ship-to-shore communication, every emergency transmission, every routine weather report from American waters gets recorded and stored here, including Morrison's final radio calls. October 18th, 1987, Harold mutters, running his finger along rows of dated storage boxes. Should be right. Here, he stops at a gap in the chronological sequence, a space where a box should be but isn't. That's odd. The box for October 15th through 20th is missing. Missing, not misfiled, not in use for research. Missing entirely. In 40 years of maritime radio archiving, Harold tells me, a box don't just disappear. Every container is tracked, logged, and accounted for with the obsessive precision of federal bureaucracy. When was the last time someone accessed these recordings? I ask. Harold consults a logbook that looks older than the building itself. November 12th, 1987, signed out by Agent Robert Hayes, Defense Intelligence Agency, also known as DIA. Never returned. Agent Robert Hayes. The name carries no meaning for me, but Harold's expression suggests it should. He explains that DIA agents rarely have legitimate interest in civilian maritime communications unless those communications compromise military operations. Hayes didn't just take the October box. Harold continues, flipping through his logbook. He also requested recordings from July through September 1987. The entire period when Morrison was reporting his sightings said it was related to a national security investigation. National security investigation, the same justification used to discredit Morrison's psychiatric evaluation, the same excuse for burying his crew's testimony. But Harold's records reveal something more troubling. The systematic removal of evidence began weeks before Morrison's disappearance, suggesting that his elimination was planned rather than reactive. Did you make backup copies? I ask, though I already suspect the answer. Harold shakes his head. Backup procedures weren't standard in 1987. These recordings were one-of-a-kind magnetic tapes. When Hayes took them, they were gone forever. Gone forever. Morrison's final transmissions, his emergency calls, his desperate attempts to communicate what he was seeing, all erased from the official record by a defense intelligence agent who understood that some truths are too dangerous to preserve. But Harold isn't finished. He leads me deeper into the archives, the past rows of more recent digital storage systems, to a section marked Unauthorized Recordings. Here, in boxes that smell of dust and forgotten secrets, are the personal collections of radio enthusiasts who monitored maritime frequencies as a hobby, amateur radio operators. Harold explains, they recorded everything that came through their equipment, official and unofficial. Most people don't know these collections exist, but they sometimes contain transmissions that were overlooked by official archives. He pulls out a box labeled K1 Ham, Personal Collection, 1987, and starts sorting through dozens of cassette tapes. Each tape is labeled with dates and frequency ranges in careful handwriting. The dedication of amateur radio operators to documenting every transmission they receive has created an unofficial backup system for maritime communications. Here, Harold says, holding up a cassette labeled October 15th through 20th, 1987, 2182 kilohertz, Maritime Emergency. This might contain Morrison's final transmissions. We move to a corner of the archive where Harold maintains vintage radio equipment for playing obsolete recording formats. The cassette player hisses to life, filling the basement with the sound of static and distant voices. Harold fast-forwards through routine shipping traffic until we reach the early morning hours of October 18th. At 0347 hours, Morrison's voice crackles through the speaker. Coast Guard Station, Boston. This is Northern Star, Whiskey Papa 739. I am observing unusual activity at coordinates 44 degrees 17 minutes north, 69 degrees 42 minutes west. Multiple underwater light sources have activated simultaneously, requesting immediate assistance. The transmission is clear, professional, showing no signs of the panic or disorientation that the official report would later claim characterized Morrison's final communications. His voice is steady, his coordinates precise, his request for assistance entirely reasonable. The Coast Guard's response comes 30 seconds later. Northern Star. This is Coast Guard Boston. No naval operations scheduled for your area. Recommend you maintain course and proceed to Halifax as planned. But Morrison doesn't maintain course. His next transmission, 5 minutes later, carries a new urgency. Coast Guard Boston. Northern Star. The light sources are moving, forming geometric patterns. I count at least 12 distinct installations. This is not natural phenomena. I am preparing to investigate. The word that sealed Morrison's fate. His decision to actively examine the installations, rather than simply report them, transformed him from an accidental witness into an active security threat. The Coast Guard's response is immediate and sharp. Northern Star. You are ordered to maintain your current heading. Do not deviate from established shipping lanes. Acknowledge. But Morrison's next transmission reveals his growing understanding of what he stumbled upon. Coast Guard Boston. I'm reading electromagnetic signatures consistent with active sonar arrays. These installations are military in nature. Why wasn't civilian shipping warned about underwater operations in this area? The question hangs in the static for nearly a minute before the Coast Guard responds. Northern Star, you are experiencing equipment malfunction. Recommend immediate return to port for technical inspection. Medical evaluation may also be advisable. Medical evaluation. Even in real time, authorities were building the narrative of Morrison's mental instability, laying groundwork for the psychiatric dismissal that would posthumously explain his impossible observations. Morrison's final transmission comes at 0421 hours, his voice now carrying the weight of terrible understanding. Coast Guard Boston. Northern Star. I know what these installations are. I know why you won't investigate. I'm documenting everything. If something happens to my ship, the evidence is hidden where you'll never find it. The evidence is hidden where you'll never find it. Morrison had prepared for the possibility that his investigation might cost him his life. Somewhere, he'd concealed documentation of what he'd seen. Photographs, coordinates, technical analysis that could vindicate his reports and expose the conspiracy to silence him. The recording continues for another hour, but Morrison's voice never returns. Coast Guard communications show increasing confusion and concern, but no rescue operations are launched. At 0630 hours, Morrison's ship is officially reported missing, but search efforts don't begin until the following afternoon. A 12-hour delay that ensured any evidence of what really happened would be scattered by currents and weather. Some maritime historians believe that the delay in search operations was intentional, allowing time for whatever destroyed Morrison's ship to be concealed or removed. The amateur radio recording reveals that Morrison's disappearance wasn't sudden or mysterious. It was the predictable conclusion to a confrontation between classified military operations and civilian maritime traffic. The folk tradition of radio monitoring includes stories about transmissions that disappear from official records but survive in the personal collections of dedicated operators. Morrison's final communications prove that he wasn't hallucinating or fabricating his reports. He was systematically documenting classified installations that military authorities were determined to protect. Harold makes me a copy of the amateur recording, understanding that Morrison's voice deserves to be heard by more than just forgotten archives and dusty federal basements. The evidence of his final hours reveals a man who knew he was in danger, but refused to abandon his pursuit of truth. "You realize what you have here," Harold says as he hands me the cassette copy. This recording proves that Morrison was eliminated for discovering classified military installations. If the wrong people find out you have this, his warning carries the weight of experience, the understanding that some evidence is dangerous to possess. But Morrison's final transmission echoes in my mind. The evidence is hidden where they'll never find it. His investigation didn't end with his death. It was preserved somewhere, waiting for someone with the courage to continue what he started. The missing radio recordings weren't lost through bureaucratic incompetence. They were deliberately destroyed to eliminate evidence of Morrison's final confrontation with classified military installations. But the amateur radio community's dedication to documenting everything has preserved Morrison's voice, his final desperate attempt to expose the truth about what lies beneath America's coastal waters. As I leave the FCC archives, Morrison's cassette secure in my jacket pocket, I realize that his investigation is far from over. His hidden evidence still waits to be discovered, and his final challenge to maritime authorities continues to echo through the static of forgotten radio frequencies. Dr. Margaret Steinberg's office in downtown Portland overlooks the harbor, where Morrison's ship made its final departure 37 years ago. She's 81 now, retired from psychiatric practice, but still sharp enough to remember the case that haunted her conscience for decades. The manila folder on her desk contains Morrison's complete psychological evaluation, the real one, not the sanitized version that became part of the official record. They wanted me to declare him mentally incompetent. Dr. Steinberg says, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she opens the folder, said it was a matter of national security, that Morrison was compromising sensitive operations with his delusions about underwater installations. The they she refers to were representatives from Naval Intelligence and Meridian Maritime Consulting, the same organizations that systematically destroyed Morrison's credibility while he was still alive. But Dr. Steinberg's private files reveal a different story than the one they forced her to write for public consumption. Morrison was one of the most psychologically stable individuals I've ever evaluated. She continues, pulling out pages of handwritten notes and psychological test results. His cognitive function was normal, his perception was acute, and his emotional state was consistent with someone who'd witnessed something extraordinary and was frustrated by official dismissal of his reports. Dr. Steinberg shows me Morrison's Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory results, the standardized test used to assess psychological stability. Morrison's scores fall well within normal ranges across all categories. No signs of paranoia, no indicators of delusional thinking, no evidence of the mental breakdown that authorities would later claim explained his impossible observations. The pressure to falsify my evaluation was intense. Dr. Steinberg admits they made it clear that my cooperation was essential to national security interests. They also made it clear that my psychiatric license could be revoked if I failed to reach the appropriate conclusions. The euphemism disguises the systematic corruption of medical evaluation for political purposes. Morrison wasn't just being discredited. His mental health was being weaponized to destroy his credibility and justify his eventual elimination. I remember that amateur radio recording from the Federal Communications Commission archives. Morrison's steady voice, reporting coordinates, and requesting assistance. His communications showed no signs of the psychological instability that Dr. Steinberg was pressured to diagnose. The contrast between Morrison's actual behavior and his psychiatric evaluation reveals the extent of the conspiracy to silence him. What did you include in the official evaluation? I ask. Dr. Steinberg's expression grows pained. I diagnosed him with acute stress reaction with paranoid features and recommended immediate suspension of his maritime license. I suggested that extended isolation at sea had compromised his judgment, and that his reports of underwater phenomena were likely hallucinations brought on by fatigue and occupational stress. She shows me the official evaluation, typed on her letterhead and signed with her credentials. The language is clinical and damning, describing Morrison as suffering from deteriorating mental state and disconnection from reality. Reading it alongside her private notes creates a disturbing picture of medical ethics corrupted by military pressure. But you kept your real evaluation. I observe. I kept everything. Dr. Steinberg confirms every test result, every honest assessment, every piece of evidence that Morrison was psychologically sound. I told myself that someday the truth would matter more than national security. Her private files contain detailed session notes that paint a picture of Morrison as a competent, articulate professional, struggling to understand why his reports were being dismissed. His descriptions of the underwater lights are methodical and precise, lacking the emotional distortion or logical inconsistencies typical of delusional thinking. Morrison brought photographs to our sessions. Dr. Steinberg reveals, producing a manila envelope from her folder, images he'd taken from his ship's deck, showing lights beneath the water's surface. The photographs were clear, detailed, obviously authentic. The photographs show exactly what Morrison described in his reports: geometric patterns of light visible through the water, arranged in regular formations that suggest artificial rather than natural origin. The images are time-stamped and include Morrison's ship's navigation equipment in the frame, providing geographic context for the underwater installations. These photographs were never included in the official case file. Dr. Steinberg explains, the naval representatives confiscated the originals and ordered me not to mention their existence in my evaluation. They said the images were classified and that discussing them would compromise national security. Classified. Morrison's photographs had documented installations so sensitive that even their existence couldn't be acknowledged in a confidential psychiatric evaluation. The military's confiscation of photographic evidence proves that Morrison's observations were accurate and that authorities were willing to corrupt medical processes to conceal classified operations. Some maritime historians believe that psychiatric evaluation became a standard tool for discrediting civilian witnesses to classified military activities during the Cold War. The diagnosis of mental instability served multiple purposes. It destroyed the witnesses' credibility, provided legal justification for preventing them from accessing sensitive areas, and created a framework for more aggressive intervention if standard discrediting failed. The folk tradition of coastal communities includes warnings about the doctors who find madness. Fishing families speak quietly about mariners who reported unusual phenomena and were subsequently declared mentally unfit, their careers destroyed by psychiatric evaluations that served military rather than medical purposes. Morrison understood what was happening to him. Dr. Steinberg continues, consulting her session notes. He told me that he'd been targeted for elimination because his observations threatened classified operations. He said he'd hidden evidence where authorities couldn't find it, insurance against the possibility that he might disappear. Hidden evidence. Morrison's reference to concealed documentation appears again, consistent with his final radio transmission about evidence hidden where they'd never find it. His preparation for the possibility of elimination suggests that he understood the danger his investigation posed to powerful interests. Did Morrison tell you where he'd hidden his evidence? I ask. Dr. Steinberg shakes her head. He was too smart to trust anyone completely, even his psychiatrist. But he did mention that he'd learned from other mariners who'd made similar discoveries. He said there was a network of people who'd seen things they weren't supposed to see, and that they'd developed ways to preserve evidence even if they didn't survive. A network of witnesses. Morrison wasn't an isolated case, but part of a broader pattern of civilian encounters with classified military operations. His connection to other mariners who'd experienced similar suppression suggests an underground community of people who'd learned to protect evidence and testimony from official destruction. What happened to Morrison's psychiatric evaluation after his disappearance? I ask. The files were sealed immediately. Dr. Steinberg explains. Naval representatives collected all official documentation within hours of Morrison being reported missing. They said the case involved classified information that required special handling, but Dr. Steinberg's private files remained hidden, preserved in her personal records for 37 years, like evidence of a crime that had never been prosecuted. Her decision to maintain accurate documentation alongside the falsified official evaluation, created a permanent record of how psychiatric authority was corrupted to serve military interests. Why are you sharing this with me now? I ask. Dr. Steinberg's expression carries the weight of decades of suppressed guilt. Because Morrison was right about everything. Because I participated in destroying an innocent man's reputation to protect military secrets. Because someone should know that he was mentally sound when they eliminated him for discovering the truth. Her confession transforms Morrison's psychiatric evaluation from medical assessment to historical document, evidence of how professional ethics were sacrificed to protect classified operations. The contrast between her private files and official records reveals the systematic nature of Morrison's persecution. As I prepare to leave her office, Dr. Steinberg hands me copies of Morrison's photographs and her private evaluation notes. Morrison said something during our final session that I've never forgotten. She tells me, he said the ocean remembers everything, even the things we try to forget. Maybe it's time to let the ocean's memory surface. The ocean's memory. Morrison's poetic description of the sea's capacity to preserve truth despite human attempts at concealment. His hidden evidence still waits beneath the waves or along forgotten shores, testimony to classified operations that cost him his life. Dr. Steinberg's secret files prove that Morrison's psychological evaluation was fraudulent, corrupted by military pressure to destroy the credibility of an inconvenient witness. His mental competence was never in question, only his survival. Once he documented installations that powerful interests were determined to keep secret, the psychiatrist's secret files reveal Morrison as a victim of systematic persecution rather than mental illness. A competent mariner whose only crime was observing classified operations and refusing to pretend he hadn't seen them. His elimination was planned and executed with the precision of a military operation, using medical authority to justify the destruction of an innocent man. The Seamen's Union Hall in Boston smells of coffee and decades of maritime stories. I'm sitting around a table with 3 retired cargo captains who sailed the same waters as Morrison during the summer of 1987. Their names are Carl Hendricks, Maria Santos, and Tom Bradley, all veterans of the North Atlantic shipping routes, all witnesses to phenomena. They've spent 37 years pretending they never saw. We called it Morrison's folly. Carl admits, his gnarled hands wrapped around a beer bottle that's grown warm during our conversation. Poor bastard kept reporting those lights, thinking somebody in authority would actually care about the truth. Carl commanded the Atlantic carrier during the summer of 1987, running cargo between Boston and Montreal along shipping lanes that passed directly over Morrison's coordinates. His ship's log from that period, which he's brought to our meeting, contains entries that were never reported to maritime authorities. July 28th, 1987. Carl reads from his personal log. Observed geometric light patterns 200 feet below surface. Coordinates 44 degrees, 17 minutes north. 69 degrees, 42 minutes west. Patterns consistent with artificial installation. Duration, 23 minutes. Decided not to report. Morrison's case shows what happens to captains who ask uncomfortable questions. Decided not to report. Carl's honest admission reveals the chilling effect that Morrison's persecution had on other mariners who witnessed the same phenomena. His systematic destruction served as a warning to potential witnesses. Report. Classified installations and face professional ruin. Psychiatric evaluation and possible elimination. Maria Santos commanded the Caribbean Dawn, a container ship that made regular runs between Boston and Halifax. During 1987, her private log contains similar entries describing underwater lights that she chose never to report to authorities. I saw Morrison at the Seamen's Club in August. Maria remembers he was desperate, trying to find other captains who'd seen the installations. I knew exactly what he was talking about, but I lied to his face, told him I'd never seen anything unusual. Maria's confession carries the weight of survivor's guilt, the knowledge that her silence contributed to Morrison's isolation and eventual fate, but her decision to stay quiet wasn't cowardice. It was self-preservation in a maritime system that punished truth-telling with career destruction. Morrison showed me photographs. She continues, clear pictures of the light formations taken from his ship's deck. The images were unmistakably artificial, too organized, too purposeful to be natural phenomena. But I still told him he was imagining things. Tom Bradley's experience was even more direct. His freighter, the Northern Pride, had a close encounter with one of the installations in September 1987, an incident that nearly cost him his command and taught him the value of official silence. I was running late, pushed my ship harder than usual to make up time. Tom explains, passed directly over Morrison's coordinates around midnight, and the whole ocean lit up like a Christmas tree. Grid patterns of light stretching for miles, bright enough to read by on deck. Tom's encounter differed from Morrison's observations in one crucial respect. His ship's depth sounder detected solid objects on the seafloor, confirming that the lights were emanating from physical installations, rather than some form of bioluminescence. The sonar showed structures, Tom continuis, rectangular shapes arranged in perfect rows, connected by what looked like cables or pipelines. I ordered my crew to photograph everything, document the coordinates, prepare a full report. But Tom's report was never filed. The morning after his encounter, he received an unexpected visit from Coast Guard representatives, who were accompanied by men in civilian clothes, who identified themselves only as federal maritime security specialists. They already knew about my encounter, Tom reveals. Showed me photographs taken from my own ship, images I hadn't even developed yet. Said the area was classified for national security purposes and that any discussion of what I'd seen would constitute a federal crime. Federal crime. Tom's visitors had transformed his accidental observation of classified installations into a criminal matter, threatening prosecution if he reported what he'd witnessed. Morrison's public campaign for investigation had marked him as a security threat, but other captains were being handled through intimidation and legal threats. I remember Dr. Steinberg's psychiatric files, her description of military representatives who demanded Morrison's mental fitness evaluation be falsified. The same system that destroyed Morrison through psychiatric dismissal was protecting other witnesses through intimidation, ensuring their silence while eliminating the captain who refused to be quiet. What happened to your photographs and documentation? I asked Tom. Confiscated. He answers simply, every image, every sonar. Reading, every piece of evidence that my encounter had occurred. They left me with a choice. Forget what I'd seen or face the same treatment they were giving Morrison. The three captains describe a pattern of intimidation that extended throughout the maritime community during the fall of 1987. Captains who'd reported unusual phenomena were visited by federal representatives and warned about the security implications of their observations. Those who'd remained silent were left alone, but those who persisted in seeking explanations faced escalating pressure. Some maritime historians believe that Morrison's public case served as both warning and cover-up. His visible persecution discouraged other witnesses from coming forward, while his psychiatric dismissal provided an explanation for any reports that couldn't be completely suppressed. The system protected classified installations by making examples of inconvenient witnesses. The folk tradition of maritime silence includes the understanding that some things seen at sea are best forgotten, that survival sometimes requires accepting official explanations, even when personal experience contradicts them. Morrison's fate reinforced this tradition, teaching an entire generation of mariners that curiosity about classified operations could be fatal. We formed an unofficial network, Maria admits, captains who'd seen the installations, but agreed to stay quiet. We shared information privately, compared observations, tried to understand what we'd witnessed, without attracting official attention. Their network included more than a dozen cargo captains, fishing boat operators, and tanker crews who'd encountered the underwater installations during the summer and fall of 1987. Their private communications, conducted through maritime radio channels and informal meetings at ports along the shipping route, created a shadow documentation of classified operations. Morrison wasn't crazy. Carl states emphatically, every one of us saw what he saw, documented what he documented. The difference was that we were smart enough to keep our mouths shut, smart enough to keep their mouths shut. Carl's frank assessment reveals the survival calculus that maritime professionals learned during Morrison's persecution. Truth-telling led to elimination, while silence ensured survival. Morrison's courage in pursuing official recognition of his observations had marked him for destruction. Did anyone try to help Morrison? I ask. The three captains exchange glances heavy with guilt and regret. Tom finally answers, we talked about it, discussed the possibility of coming forward together. presenting a united front that authorities couldn't dismiss as easily as one isolated captain. But their discussions never translated into action. Morrison's visible deterioration, his psychiatric evaluation, his license suspension, his growing desperation, served as a constant reminder of what awaited mariners who challenged classified operations. By October, it was too late. Tom continues. Morrison was marked for elimination. Anyone who supported him would have been targeted as well. We chose self-preservation over solidarity. Their choice is understandable but tragic. Morrison faced his final voyage alone, abandoned by fellow professionals who'd witnessed the same phenomena but lacked his courage to demand official recognition. His isolation was carefully orchestrated by authorities who understood that unsupported witnesses were easier to eliminate than coordinated groups of maritime professionals. As our meeting ends, the three captains make me promise to tell Morrison's story accurately, to reveal that his observations were confirmed by multiple independent witnesses who were too frightened to support him publicly. Their testimony proves that Morrison's reports were neither delusions nor fabrications. They were accurate documentation of classified installations that cost him his life. The other captain's silence wasn't cowardice, but survival strategy in a maritime system that eliminated inconvenient witnesses. Their private network preserved evidence of the installations that Morrison died trying to expose, creating an underground memory of classified operations that authorities believed they'd successfully buried. Morrison's isolation was artificial, created by intimidation and threats that prevented other witnesses from supporting his investigation. His courage in pursuing truth despite systematic persecution makes his eventual fate not just tragic but heroic. The sacrifice of a mariner who refused to pretend he hadn't seen what lay beneath the waves. Elizabeth Morrison's house sits on a bluff overlooking Casco Bay, where her husband's ship disappeared 40 years ago this October. She's 78 now, her hair silver white, her hands marked by decades of keeping secrets too dangerous to share. When she opens the door, I see Morrison's eyes looking back at me. The same intensity, the same unwillingness to accept comfortable lies over difficult truths. "You're here about Jimmy," she says without preamble. "Took you long enough." Elizabeth leads me through a house that feels like a maritime museum, nautical charts covering the walls, ship models occupying every shelf, and photographs of Morrison's vessels displayed like shrines to a lost career. But it's what she's hidden rather than what she's displayed that brings me here today. They came for his things 3 days after he disappeared. Elizabeth tells me, settling into a chair that faces the water, where her husband made his final voyage. Coast Guard investigators, insurance adjusters, men in suits who never identified themselves properly. They went through everything: his office, his personal papers, his navigational equipment, but they didn't find what they were looking for. Morrison had anticipated that his investigation might cost him his life, and he'd prepared for that possibility by concealing his most sensitive documentation where official searchers would never think to look. Jimmy knew they were going to kill him. Elizabeth states with matter-of-fact certainty, "The last time I saw him, he told me that if anything happened to his ship, I should wait 40 years before sharing what he'd given me. 40 years. Until everyone involved in the cover-up was dead or too old to matter." 40 years. Morrison's timeline suggests he understood that his evidence would be dangerous for decades, that the classified operations he documented would remain sensitive long after his elimination. His wife became the keeper of secrets that could destroy careers and expose military operations that officially never existed. Elizabeth disappears into her basement, returning with a waterproof container that looks like standard maritime survival gear, but inside the container is Morrison's real legacy: his personal logbook, photographs of the underwater installations, and technical analysis that proves the lights were artificial rather than natural phenomena. This is Jimmy's private log, Elizabeth explains, handling the leather-bound book with reverent care. Everything he saw, everything he measured, everything he understood about those installations. The real record, not the sanitized version they found on his ship. Morrison's private log is extraordinary in its detail and precision. Each entry includes coordinates, timing, weather conditions, and sketches of the light formations he observed. But more importantly, it includes his evolving understanding of what the installations represented: temporary naval monitoring stations, designed to track Soviet submarine movements during the final years of the Cold War. Jimmy figured out the pattern. Elizabeth continues, pointing to charts where Morrison had mapped the installation's locations. They weren't random. They followed suspected Soviet submarine routes, positioned to monitor traffic that other detection systems might miss. Morrison's analysis shows remarkable insight for a civilian cargo captain. His observations had led him to correctly identify the installations as elements of a classified submarine tracking network, making his reports far more threatening to military authorities than simple descriptions of unexplained lights. I remember Dr. Whitfield's reluctant admissions about Project Deepwatch, the temporary surveillance platforms that were deployed and removed according to intelligence requirements. Morrison's private log contains enough technical detail to compromise the entire operation, revealing not just the installation's existence, but their purpose and strategic importance. The photographs are the real proof, Elizabeth says, producing an envelope containing dozens of images that Morrison had secretly taken from his ship. The pictures show the underwater lights in perfect clarity, geometric patterns of illumination that could only be artificial, arranged in grids that match the formations Dr. Whitfield described for military surveillance platforms. But the photographs reveal something more disturbing than simple documentation of classified installations. Several images show Morrison's ship being approached by unmarked vessels, dark shapes that appear to be military patrol boats, maintaining surveillance of civilian shipping in the area. Jimmy was being watched, Elizabeth explains. Every time he passed over the installation coordinates, those boats would appear. They were tracking him, documenting his movements, building a case for eliminating him as a security threat. Elizabeth's frank assessment aligns with Dr. Whitfield's description of Morrison being classified as expendable when his reports threatened to expose classified operations. The photographs prove that Morrison's persecution wasn't reactive but systematic, involving dedicated surveillance resources that treated him as an active enemy agent. Did Morrison know he was under surveillance? I ask. Of course he knew. Elizabeth replies. Jimmy was a professional mariner. He could spot pursuit vessels, recognize when his communications were being monitored, identify when his ship was being tracked by radar systems that weren't supposed to be there. Morrison's awareness of surveillance explains his decision to conceal evidence rather than continue reporting through official channels. By the time of his final voyage, he understood that maritime authorities were compromised and that his only hope for exposing the truth lay in preserving documentation that would survive his elimination. Some maritime historians believe that Morrison's case represents the collision between Cold War military secrecy and civilian rights. With predictable results for the civilian caught in the middle, his detailed documentation of classified installations made him a legitimate target for elimination under the logic of national security. The folk tradition of maritime widows includes stories about women who kept their husbands' secrets for decades, preserving evidence of maritime mysteries that authorities worked to suppress. Elizabeth Morrison belongs to this tradition, serving as guardian of truth that was too dangerous to reveal, while the principles involved remained alive. Jimmy's final entry is the most important, Elizabeth tells me, turning to the last page of Morrison's private log, written in his careful handwriting, dated October 17th, 1987, are words that explain everything. They've activated defensive systems. The installations are no longer just monitoring, they're protecting themselves. Tomorrow I dive to get physical proof. If I don't return, Elizabeth knows where to find the evidence. Defensive systems. Morrison's final entry confirms Dr. Whitfield's revelation about the installation's autonomous response capabilities. Morrison's decision to dive on the installations had triggered defensive protocols that eliminated him as a security threat, making his death not just murder, but automated execution by classified military technology. Where did Morrison hide the physical evidence? I ask. Elizabeth's expression grows cautious. That's a secret Jimmy took to his grave, but he left clues, coordinates that point to a location where he cached equipment and documentation that would prove everything he claimed. She shows me Morrison's final chart, where he'd marked specific coordinates in red ink, not the location of the installations themselves, but somewhere else entirely, a place where he'd hidden physical proof of what he'd discovered. The coordinates point to a small island in Penobscot Bay, uninhabited and rarely visited by civilian vessels. Jimmy used to anchor there during storms. Elizabeth explains, called it his thinking place, where he could study his charts and plan his next moves without worrying about surveillance. If he hid evidence anywhere, it would be there. The island represents Morrison's final gambit, a cache of physical proof that could vindicate his reports and expose the conspiracy that led to his elimination. His widow has preserved not just his documentation, but the location where more evidence waits to be recovered. Why are you sharing this with me now? I ask. Elizabeth's gaze moves to the window, where afternoon light reflects off the same waters that swallowed her husband 4 decades ago. Because Jimmy was right about everything. Because the truth matters more than the comfort of believing official lies. Because someone should know that he died a hero, not a madman. Her decision to finally reveal Morrison's hidden evidence transforms his story from tragedy to vindication. The private log, photographs, and cached physical proof prove that Morrison was eliminated, not for being crazy, but for being right, for documenting classified installations that military authorities were willing to kill to protect. As I prepare to leave Elizabeth's house, she hands me Morrison's final chart with the coordinates of his hidden cache. Jimmy always said, "The ocean remembers everything." She tells me, maybe it's time to let the ocean give back what it's been keeping safe. The widow's hidden truth reveals Morrison as a martyr to classified military operations, rather than a victim of mental illness. His careful preparation for elimination, his concealment of evidence, and his wife's 40-year guardianship of secrets prove that his investigation was thorough, accurate, and ultimately successful in documenting the installations that cost him his life. Elizabeth Morrison's decision to finally share her husband's evidence marks the beginning of his vindication. The moment when carefully preserved truth emerges from decades of enforced silence to challenge the official narrative that destroyed an innocent man's reputation and life. The Naval War College Library in Newport, Rhode Island, houses documents that most researchers never see, declassified files that have been declassified after decades of secrecy, research papers that reveal the true scope of Cold War underwater surveillance operations. I'm sitting in a reading room that overlooks Narragansett Bay, surrounded by boxes of materials related to submarine detection technology developed during the 1980s. The librarian, Dr. Patricia Williams, is a former naval intelligence officer who understands the significance of what I'm investigating. When I mention Morrison's coordinates and the timeline of his observations, her expression grows serious. Project Deepwatch, she says quietly. I wondered when someone would finally connect those dots. Dr. Williams leads me to a section of the archives marked Declassified Naval Research, Cold War Period. Here, in boxes that smell of decades-old secrets, are the technical specifications for the underwater surveillance platforms that Morrison died documenting. The reality is even more sophisticated than Dr. Whitfield revealed. Deepwatch wasn't just submarine detection, Dr. Williams explained, pulling out engineering diagrams that match Morrison's sketches with unsettling accuracy. It was the prototype for autonomous underwater defense networks, installations that could identify, track, and eliminate threats without human oversight. Eliminate threats without human oversight. The phrase sends ice through my veins as I remember Morrison's final log entry about defensive systems activating. He hadn't just documented surveillance equipment. He discovered weapons platforms capable of autonomous lethal response. The technical documents revealed Deepwatch as far more ambitious than simple monitoring stations. Each installation included sonar arrays, communications equipment, and what the specifications euphemistically call threat neutralization capabilities. Underwater weapon systems designed to destroy submarines, surface vessels, or diving equipment that approached too closely. The installations were controlled by early artificial intelligence systems. Dr. Williams continues, showing me computer printouts from 1987 that look primitive by today's standards, but were revolutionary for their time. They could analyze acoustic signatures, classify targets as friendly or hostile, and execute attack protocols without waiting for human authorization. The artificial intelligence classification system explains Morrison's fate with terrifying clarity. His repeated approaches to the installation coordinates, his obvious documentation efforts, his deployment of diving equipment during his final voyage. All would have triggered automated threat assessment protocols that classified him as a hostile intelligence asset, requiring immediate elimination. I remember the amateur radio recording of Morrison's final transmissions, his steady voice reporting electromagnetic signatures and military installations. He'd been documenting weapons platforms that were simultaneously documenting him, building a case for his elimination through automated threat analysis that reduced human life to tactical calculations. How many Deepwatch installations were deployed? I ask. Dr. Williams consults a deployment roster that lists installation sites throughout the North Atlantic. 47 platforms between 1985 and 1989, most concentrated along suspected Soviet submarine routes. Installation Bravo 7, at Morrison's coordinates, was one of the most advanced, a prototype for systems that would eventually be deployed globally. 47 platforms. Morrison had stumbled upon just one element of a vast underwater weapons network that spanned thousands of miles of ocean. His documentation threatened to expose not just local installations, but an entire strategic defense system that represented billions of dollars in classified research and development. The files reveal that Deepwatch installations were designed for temporary deployment, activated during periods of heightened Soviet submarine activity, and removed when intelligence requirements changed. But the weapon systems required constant monitoring to prevent accidents. Civilian vessels approaching the platforms needed to be warned away, or, if warnings failed, eliminated as potential security breaches. Morrison's cargo ship would have been tracked from the moment it entered the installation's sensor range. Dr. Williams explains, showing me tracking protocols that monitored all surface vessels within a 50-mile radius. His repeated returns to the same coordinates would have triggered escalating threat assessments. The threat assessment progression is documented in chilling detail. Initial identification as potential surveillance asset, escalation to probable intelligence gathering, final classification as hostile operative requiring neutralization. Morrison's persistence in documenting the installations had followed this progression exactly, making his elimination inevitable once automated systems classified him as a security threat. Some maritime historians believe that Deepwatch represented the militarization of oceanographic research, transforming scientific exploration into weapons development that prioritized strategic advantage over civilian safety. Morrison's case demonstrates the human cost of deploying lethal autonomous systems in waters used by civilian shipping. The folk tradition of naval research includes warnings about weapons that think for themselves, automated systems that remove human judgment from life and death decisions. Morrison became a victim of such systems, eliminated by artificial intelligence that valued installation security more than human life. Were there other civilian casualties? I ask. Dr. Williams's expression grows troubled. The files mention 17 civilian incidents during Deepwatch operations, but details are still classified. Morrison's case was unusual only because his reports became public before his elimination. 17 civilian incidents. Morrison wasn't the only civilian killed by Deepwatch installations, just the only one whose documentation survived to tell the story. The other 16 remain anonymous, their deaths attributed to storms, equipment failures, or navigation errors that concealed the true cause of their elimination. What happened to the Deepwatch program after Morrison's death? I ask. Terminated in 1988. Dr. Williams replies, officially due to budget constraints and changing strategic priorities. Unofficially, Morrison's case had attracted too much attention. His widow's questions, the amateur radio operators who'd recorded his final transmissions, the maritime community's awareness that something had happened. It all created too much risk of exposure. Morrison's investigation had succeeded in ways he never lived to see. His documentation, his widow's preservation of evidence, his final transmissions recorded by radio enthusiasts, all had combined to create enough pressure to shut down the entire Deepwatch program. His death had saved other civilians from similar automated execution. The technical files include post-mortem analysis of Morrison's elimination, clinical documentation of how the installation's defensive systems had detected his approach, classified him as a threat, and executed attack protocols designed to leave no evidence of artificial cause. His death was made to appear like a typical maritime accident, preserving the secret of the installations while eliminating an inconvenient witness. Morrison's ship was destroyed by cavitation charges. Dr. Williams reveals, showing me weapon specifications that describe underwater explosives designed to simulate structural failure or collision damage. The installation's artificial intelligence calculated that cavitation charges would create debris patterns consistent with catastrophic hull failure in heavy seas. Cavitation charges. Morrison's ship hadn't been lost to storms or navigation errors. It had been deliberately destroyed by underwater weapons that were programmed to eliminate threats while concealing evidence of military involvement. His death was assassination by artificial intelligence, carried out with the precision of a surgical strike. Is there any record of Morrison's final approach to the installation? I ask. Dr. Williams produces a file marked Bravo 7 Incident Report that contains the installation's automated log of Morrison's elimination. The data is presented in cold, technical language that reduces Morrison's final moments to sensor readings and tactical calculations. Target vessel approached within defensive perimeter at 0421 hours. Threat assessment. Level 5. Neutralization authorized. Cavitation charges deployed at 0423 hours. Target vessel destroyed. Debris pattern analysis. Consistent with accidental hull failure. 2 minutes. Morrison's 40-year maritime career had ended in 2 minutes of automated calculation that determined his death was necessary to protect classified installations. The installation's log shows no hesitation, no consideration of alternatives, just efficient execution of programmed protocols that treated human life as an acceptable casualty of national security. The Naval Research Connection reveals Morrison's case as more than simple military cover-up. It was the inevitable result of deploying lethal autonomous systems in civilian waters without adequate safeguards or oversight. His death represents the dark side of naval innovation, where technological advancement proceeded without sufficient consideration of human consequences. As I leave the Naval War College Library, Morrison's real killer finally stands, revealed not human malice or bureaucratic incompetence, but artificial intelligence programmed to protect military secrets at any cost. His documentation of Deepwatch installations had triggered automated responses that eliminated him as efficiently as they would have destroyed an enemy submarine. The naval research files prove that Morrison was killed by the very technology he'd been documenting, making him both witness and victim of automated warfare systems that valued installation security more than human life. His investigation had uncovered weapons platforms that were simultaneously building a case for his elimination through artificial intelligence that recognized no distinction between enemy agents and curious civilians. Morrison's vindication lies not just in proving he was right about the installations, but in revealing that he was eliminated by systems designed to operate without human oversight or moral consideration. His death wasn't just murder, it was execution by algorithm, carried out by technology that had learned to kill without conscience. The lobster dock in Bar Harbor operates before dawn, when the water is still dark and the only lights come from working boats preparing for another day of hauling traps. I'm meeting with 3 generations of the Arsenault family: grandfather René, father Michel, and son David, who've fished these waters for 70 years and witnessed phenomena that maritime authorities have spent decades trying to suppress. We called them les lumières de l'enfer. René tells me in accented English, his weathered hands mending nets with automatic precision. The lights of hell, they'd appear on calm nights, burning beneath our boats like the devil's own lanterns. René is 89, the last of a generation of French-Canadian fishermen who worked these waters during World War II and the early Cold War. His memories stretch back to the 1940s, when the first experimental underwater installations were deployed to monitor German U-boat activity along the American coast. The lights started during the war. René continues, government men came to the fishing cooperatives, told us we'd see things that weren't our business, said we should fish elsewhere if we valued our licenses and our lives. But the Arsenault family had fished these waters for generations. Their livelihood depended on intimate knowledge of underwater topography that couldn't be easily transferred to different areas. They learned to work around the installations, timing their fishing to avoid periods when the lights were most active. Michel Arsenault, Renaissance, began fishing in the 1960s when Cold War installations were becoming more sophisticated and more dangerous to civilian vessels. His logbooks from the 1980s, which he's brought to our dawn meeting, contain entries that directly corroborate Morrison's observations. July 15th, 1987. Michel reads from his fishing log. Lights active grid pattern. 44 degrees, 17 minutes north. 69 degrees, 42 minutes west. Duration 3 hours, 20 minutes. Avoided area for safety. The coordinates match Morrison's reports exactly, confirming that both commercial fishermen and cargo captains were observing the same underwater phenomena. But Michel's logs reveal something that Morrison never lived: to document the installation's effects on marine life. His catch records from 1987 show dramatic declines in lobster and fish populations around the installation coordinates, suggesting that the platforms were affecting the ocean ecosystem in ways that military planners hadn't anticipated. The fish knew to stay away. Michel explains. Lobsters wouldn't set up in areas where the lights appeared. Even whales changed their migration routes to avoid the installations. Animals understand danger better than humans sometimes. David Arsenault, the youngest generation, started fishing in the 1990s after the Deepwatch installations had been removed. But the ocean's memory is longer than official secrecy. The seafloor still shows scars from the platforms, and marine life continues to avoid areas where the installations once operated. I can show you the dead zones. David offers consulting GPS coordinates on his boat's fish finder. Rectangular areas where nothing grows, nothing lives. The ocean floor looks like it's been burned. 30 years after whatever was down there got removed. The dead zones correspond precisely to the installation coordinates that Morrison documented, and Dr. Williams's declassified files confirmed the Deepwatch platforms hadn't just monitored submarine traffic. They'd sterilized sections of ocean floor, creating environmental damage that persists decades after their removal. I remember Elizabeth Morrison's revelation about her husband's hidden cache of physical evidence. The Arsenault family's environmental observations suggest that Morrison's evidence might include water samples, sediment analysis, or biological specimens that prove the installation's ecological impact. Did you ever see Morrison's ship in these waters? I ask. René nods grimly. Poor bastard was marked for death from the first time he anchored over the lights. We tried to warn him, told him these weren't fishing grounds for outsiders, that smart boats stayed away from the government lights. But Morrison hadn't understood the coded warnings of local fishing families, who'd learned to communicate about classified installations through euphemism and indirection. His persistence in documenting the platforms had marked him as an outsider who didn't respect the unwritten rules that kept civilian vessels safe from military retaliation. The night he disappeared, Michel remembers, we heard explosions from the direction of the installations, underwater blasts that shook our boat, even though we were 5 miles away. Next morning, Coast Guard boats were everywhere, but they weren't searching. They were cleaning up. Michel's observation aligns with the technical documentation from Naval War College archives, which described post-elimination protocols designed to remove evidence of automated weapons attacks. Morrison's death had triggered military cleanup operations that ensured no physical evidence of his assassination would survive. Some maritime historians believe that local fishing communities served as early warning networks for classified military operations, using traditional communication methods to share information about installation activities and dangerous periods when civilian vessels should avoid certain areas. The Arsenault family's generational knowledge represents this tradition. The folk wisdom of fishing families includes detailed understanding of how underwater installations affect marine ecosystems, knowledge that military planners often ignore in favor of strategic considerations. Morrison's case demonstrates what happens when outside observers lack access to this local expertise. We kept records, David reveals, producing a waterproof container filled with fishing logs, water quality measurements, and photographs spanning 7 decades of family fishing operations. Every strange light, every dead zone, every time fish populations crashed after military activity, our own family archive of what they did to our waters. The Arsenault family archive is extraordinary, a civilian documentation of military underwater activities that spans from World War II through the present day. Their records provide context for Morrison's observations, showing that the Deepwatch installations were just the latest in a series of classified platforms that had operated in these waters for generations. Morrison wasn't the first to die for asking questions. Renee states, with the certainty of long experience. We lost fishermen during the war, during the 50s, during the 80s. Official reports always blamed storms or equipment failure, but we knew better. The fisherman's corroboration reveals Morrison as part of a broader pattern of civilian casualties from classified underwater operations. His case gained attention because he was a licensed cargo captain whose reports couldn't be easily dismissed. But fishing families had been losing members to installation defensive systems for decades. Why didn't you report what you witnessed? I ask. Michelle's laugh carries no humor. Report to who? The same Coast Guard that cleaned up after Morrison's murder, the same maritime authorities that issue our fishing licenses. We learned long ago that some truths are too dangerous to speak outside family. The fishing family's silence wasn't cowardice, but survival strategy developed over generations of living with classified military operations in their traditional fishing grounds. Their decision to preserve evidence privately while remaining publicly silent had protected them from Morrison's fate, while maintaining records that could eventually document the truth. As dawn breaks over Bar Harbor, the Arsenault family's boats prepare to head out for another day of fishing, around the scars left by installations that officially never existed. Their generational knowledge proves that Morrison's observations were accurate. His documentation was correct, and his elimination was necessary only to protect military operations that had been killing civilians for decades. The fisherman's corroboration transforms Morrison from isolated victim to representative casualty of military operations that prioritize strategic advantage over civilian safety. His courage in publicly documenting the installations makes him a hero not just to his family, but to fishing communities who'd been forced to accept unofficial casualties as the price of living with classified underwater warfare. The 3 generations of Arsenault fishermen hand me copies of their family archive. 70 years of evidence that classified installations have operated in American coastal waters, affecting marine ecosystems and eliminating civilian vessels that approach too closely. Their decision to finally share this documentation represents their tribute to Morrison's memory and their contribution to his posthumous vindication. As I leave the lobster dock, the morning sun revealing the full scope of waters where Morrison died pursuing truth, I understand that his investigation succeeded in ways he never imagined. His documentation, combined with the fishing family's generational records, creates an undeniable case that classified underwater weapons platforms have operated in civilian waters for decades, eliminating inconvenient witnesses and covering their tracks through official lies and bureaucratic deception. The Maritime Insurance Institute building in Hartford, Connecticut, houses actuarial data that tells the real story of shipping losses in American coastal waters. I'm meeting with Rebecca Matthews, a former claims investigator who spent 30 years analyzing maritime casualties for Lloyd's of London. Her files contain patterns of ship losses that official maritime authorities have never acknowledged. Morrison's case was unusual because it generated paperwork. Rebecca explains, settling into her office chair, surrounded by boxes of insurance files dating back to the 1940s. Most vessels that disappear in classified operation areas never result in claims because the incidents are handled through military channels. Military channels. Rebecca's casual reference to alternative processing systems reveals the existence of parallel bureaucracies designed to handle civilian casualties from classified operations, without creating insurance liability or public records. The Northern Star claim was flagged immediately. Rebecca continues, producing a thick file marked with stamps indicating special handling procedures. Meridian Maritime Consulting contacted us within hours of the disappearance. Before we'd even received official notification from the Coast Guard, Meridian Maritime Consulting, the same organization that removed Morrison's personal logbook from Coast Guard archives and pressured Dr. Steinberg to falsify his psychiatric evaluation, their immediate contact with insurance companies suggests a coordinated effort to control all aspects of Morrison's case, ensuring that even financial records supported the official narrative of accidental loss. What was unusual about Meridian's involvement? I ask. Rebecca's expression grows cautious. They offered to handle the entire investigation pro bono, claiming it was part of a federal maritime safety initiative. In 30 years of claims work, I'd never seen a consulting firm volunteer to absorb investigation costs for a routine cargo vessel loss. But Morrison's loss wasn't routine, and Meridian's involvement wasn't voluntary. It was part of the systematic cover-up that began even before his elimination. Their offer to handle the investigation ensured that insurance companies wouldn't conduct independent analysis that might reveal evidence of military involvement in civilian shipping casualties. "Did you accept Meridian's offer?" I ask. "We had no choice." Rebecca admits, "Federal maritime authorities made it clear that independent investigation would compromise national security interests. We were instructed to accept Meridian's findings and process the claim based on their conclusions." Instructed by federal authorities, the insurance industry's compliance with military pressure reveals another layer of the conspiracy that eliminated Morrison and concealed the evidence of his assassination. Even private companies that should have been motivated by financial interests to uncover the truth were forced to accept official explanations that protected classified operations. Rebecca shows me Meridian's investigation report, a document that bears little resemblance to standard maritime casualty analysis. Instead of detailed technical examination, weather analysis, and crew background checks, the report focuses almost exclusively on Morrison's alleged mental instability and the supposed storm conditions that the Coast Guard fabricated. Meridian's report was clearly written to support predetermined conclusions. Rebecca observes, the investigation techniques were superficial, the evidence analysis was incomplete, and the final conclusions didn't match the physical data we had access to independently. Physical data: insurance companies maintain their own weather monitoring systems, satellite tracking capabilities, and maritime traffic analysis that can contradict official reports when those reports are fabricated to conceal classified operations. What did your independent data show about Morrison's disappearance? I ask. Rebecca consults computer printouts from 1987 that show satellite weather data, shipping traffic patterns, and emergency beacon information. Clear skies, calm seas, normal shipping traffic. No evidence of the severe weather conditions that supposedly caused Morrison's loss. The only unusual activity was the presence of unidentified vessels in the area where Morrison disappeared. Unidentified vessels. Rebecca's insurance data confirms Morrison's widow's revelation about the unmarked boats that had been tracking his ship. The insurance industry's satellite monitoring had detected military vessels in Morrison's vicinity, evidence that was suppressed by Meridian's investigation and buried in classified files. I remember the Naval War College archives. The documentation of Deepwatch installations' defensive capabilities and automated threat response systems. Morrison's elimination hadn't required direct military intervention. The installations themselves had weapons systems capable of destroying approaching vessels without leaving evidence of artificial cause. Were there other maritime losses in the same area during 1987? I ask. Rebecca produces a map showing shipping casualties along the North Atlantic coast during the Deepwatch operational period. The pattern is unmistakable, an unusual concentration of vessel losses around coordinates where classified installations were deployed, with casualty rates far exceeding historical averages for those waters. 17 civilian vessels lost in installation areas between 1985 and 1989. Rebecca reveals, all attributed to weather, equipment failure, or navigation errors, all investigated by Meridian Maritime Consulting, all resulting in rapid claim settlements that discouraged further investigation. 17 civilian vessels. Rebecca's insurance data confirms Dr. Williams's reference to civilian incidents during Deepwatch operations, revealing Morrison as just one victim of a systematic program that eliminated potential witnesses to classified underwater warfare installations. Some maritime historians believe that insurance industry records provide the most accurate documentation of military activities in civilian waters, because actuarial data requires precise analysis of loss patterns and casualty causes. Meridian's involvement in multiple investigations suggests a coordinated effort to suppress evidence of military involvement in civilian shipping losses. The folk tradition of maritime insurance includes understanding that some claims are handled differently, cases where normal investigation procedures are bypassed in favor of rapid settlement and file closure. Morrison's case exemplifies this tradition, showing how financial institutions can be co-opted into military cover-up operations. Did any insurance companies resist federal pressure to accept Meridian's findings? I ask. A few tried. Rebecca admits. Smaller firms that weren't dependent on federal maritime contracts attempted independent investigation. Most were visited by federal representatives who explained the national security implications of their curiosity. Federal representatives. The same intimidation tactics used against maritime captains and fishing families were applied to insurance companies, ensuring that financial institutions wouldn't pursue investigations that might expose classified operations or reveal evidence of military involvement in civilian casualties. What happened to companies that persisted in independent investigation? I ask. Rebecca's expression grows troubled. They lost their federal maritime insurance contracts, were excluded from shipping industry consortiums, faced regulatory investigations that questioned their business practices. The message was clear: cooperate with cover-up operations or face financial destruction. The insurance industry's forced cooperation reveals the scope of the conspiracy that eliminated Morrison and concealed evidence of classified underwater warfare operations. Even private companies motivated by financial interests to uncover truth were compelled to accept fabricated explanations that protected military installations. Did you keep independent records of the cases that Meridian handled? I ask. Rebecca produces a filing cabinet marked anomalous claims, personal reference only. Inside are copies of insurance data, satellite information, and technical analysis that contradict the official explanations for maritime casualties in installation areas. I knew these cases would matter someday. Rebecca explains. The patterns were too obvious. The cover-up was too systematic. Someone would eventually connect the dots and need documentation that independent analysis had been suppressed. Her personal files reveal insurance industry awareness that maritime casualties around classified installations weren't accidental. They were the predictable result of deploying lethal defensive systems in civilian shipping lanes. The industry's compliance with military pressure protected classified operations while enabling the systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses. Morrison's case was different because he generated public attention before his elimination. Rebecca observes. Most victims disappear quietly. Their families accept official explanations, and the insurance claims get processed without anyone questioning the patterns. Morrison's public campaign for investigation had made his case more difficult to suppress than the other 16 civilian casualties from Deepwatch operations. His persistence in documenting the installations had forced military authorities to deploy more extensive cover-up resources, including corruption of insurance industry investigation procedures. As I prepare to leave Hartford, Rebecca hands me copies of her personal files documenting insurance industry suppression of evidence in maritime casualty cases involving classified installations. Her decision to preserve independent records proves that Morrison's case was part of a broader pattern of civilian elimination that insurance companies were forced to enable through corrupted investigation procedures. The insurance company's interest in Morrison's case wasn't financial, it was political, part of a coordinated effort to ensure that even private industry records supported the official narrative of accidental loss rather than military assassination. Their forced cooperation reveals the extent of institutional corruption necessary to maintain classified underwater warfare operations in civilian waters. Rebecca's files prove that insurance industry data contradicted official explanations for Morrison's disappearance, providing additional evidence that his elimination was planned and executed by military systems designed to protect classified installations from civilian discovery. Her preservation of suppressed evidence contributes to Morrison's vindication, while exposing the systematic nature of cover-up operations that enabled decades of civilian casualties. The research vessel Deep Truth anchors over Morrison's coordinates on a calm October morning, exactly 40 years after his disappearance. Dr. Elena Vasquez and her team from Woods Hole have equipped the vessel with the most advanced sonar and underwater imaging technology available, capable of revealing details that were invisible to 1980s detection systems. If Morrison was right about underwater structures, Dr. Vasquez explains as her team deploys the deep-sea scanning array, modern technology should be able to prove it definitively. The sonar data appears on high-resolution monitors in real time, revealing the ocean floor with unprecedented clarity. What we see transforms Morrison's impossible reports into undeniable reality. Geometric impressions in the seafloor sediment, that match his sketches exactly, connected by linear depressions that show where cables once linked the installation components. Look at this, Dr. Vasquez calls out, pointing to sonar readings that show perfect rectangular shapes carved into the ocean floor. These formations are absolutely artificial. The edges are too precise, the spacing too regular to be natural phenomena. The sonar maps reveal not just one installation, but elements of a vast underwater network, dozens of rectangular impressions arranged in the grid pattern that Morrison documented, connected by cable trenches that extend for miles across the ocean floor. His observations had captured only a fraction of the Deepwatch system's true scope, but the most compelling evidence comes from the sediment analysis. Core samples taken from the installation sites contain metal fragments, electronic components, and chemical residues that prove technological systems operated in these locations during the 1980s. Morrison's hallucinations were actual documentation of classified military hardware. The chemical signatures are consistent with military-grade electronics and weapons systems. Dr. Vasquez reports, analyzing sediment samples under the vessel's laboratory microscopes, these installations weren't just monitoring equipment, they were armed platforms capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. Armored platforms. The sediment analysis confirms the Naval War College documentation about Deepwatch installations' lethal capabilities, proving that Morrison had discovered underwater weapon systems rather than simple surveillance equipment. His elimination becomes even more understandable when viewed as automated defense of classified weapons platforms. I remember Morrison's widow, Elizabeth, providing coordinates for her husband's hidden cache of physical evidence. The island in Penobscot Bay, where Morrison concealed his final documentation, lies just 30 miles from our current position, close enough to visit during this expedition. Can we make a detour to investigate Morrison's evidence cache? I ask Dr. Vasquez. She checks the vessel's schedule and navigational charts. We have time before we need to return to port. If Morrison really hid physical proof of these installations, it could provide the final confirmation of his observations. The research vessel changes course toward the small island where Morrison spent his final days documenting what he discovered. The island is uninhabited, covered with pine trees, and surrounded by rocky shores that provide natural concealment for someone who needed to hide evidence from military surveillance. Using Morrison's final chart and Elizabeth's directions, we locate the area where he would have concealed his cache. Ground-penetrating radar reveals a buried container approximately 6 feet below the surface, protected by rocks and vegetation that have grown over it during 4 decades of concealment. The excavation reveals Morrison's final gift to Vindication, a waterproof case containing underwater photographs, water samples, metal fragments, and technical analysis that proves the installations were real, armed, and operational during the summer of 1987. His hidden evidence provides the physical proof that his reports were accurate, and his elimination was necessary to protect classified operations. These photographs are extraordinary. Dr. Vasquez marvels, examining Morrison's underwater images of the installation structures. The detail is remarkable. You can see individual components, cable connections, even what appear to be weapon systems, mounted on the platforms. Morrison's cache includes more than just photographs. His water samples, preserved in sealed containers, contain the same chemical signatures that modern analysis detected in seafloor sediment. His metal fragments match the electronic components found in current core samples. His technical analysis, written in careful handwriting, accurately describes the installation's defensive capabilities and automated response systems, but the most powerful vindication comes from Morrison's final document, a detailed technical assessment that proves he understood exactly what he'd discovered. His analysis correctly identifies the installations as elements of a submarine detection network with autonomous weapons capabilities, demonstrating that his impossible observations were actually sophisticated intelligence gathering that military authorities couldn't afford to acknowledge. Some maritime historians believe that Morrison's case represents the collision between civilian curiosity and military secrecy, with predictable results for the civilian caught in the middle. But his successful concealment of evidence proves that truth can survive systematic attempts at suppression, waiting for the right moment and the right technology to emerge. The folk tradition of maritime vindication includes stories about sailors whose impossible observations were eventually proven accurate by advancing technology and changing political circumstances. Morrison belongs to this tradition, joining mariners whose courage in documenting classified phenomena ultimately contributed to historical truth. Morrison's evidence is conclusive. Dr. Vasquez states, as we examine his hidden documentation, his observations were accurate, his technical analysis was correct, and his elimination was clearly motivated by his discovery of classified weapons platforms. The final vindication extends beyond proving Morrison's reports were accurate. It reveals him as a martyr to classified underwater warfare operations that prioritized military secrecy over civilian safety. His systematic documentation of Deepwatch installations, preserved despite official attempts at suppression, provides undeniable evidence of automated weapon systems operating in civilian waters. Modern sonar technology reveals the scars left by installations that Morrison died documenting, while his hidden cache provides physical proof that his observations were methodical, accurate, and threatening enough to military interests to justify his elimination. The combination of advanced detection capabilities and preserved evidence creates an unassailable case for Morrison's vindication. What's the next step? I asked Dr. Vasquez as we prepare to return Morrison's evidence to proper historical archives. Publication, she replies. Morrison's story needs to be told completely, with all the evidence that proves his observations were accurate and his elimination was unjustified. The maritime community deserves to know that he died pursuing truth, not chasing hallucinations. The research expedition's findings will be published in peer-reviewed journals, ensuring that Morrison's vindication receives scientific validation and academic recognition. His case will become part of the historical record, transforming him from discredited cargo captain to legitimate whistleblower whose courage exposed classified operations that cost civilian lives. As the Deep Truth returns to port, Morrison's evidence secure in climate-controlled storage, I reflect on the journey from lighthouse keepers' warnings to final vindication. Morrison's story proves that institutional power can suppress truth temporarily, but cannot destroy it permanently. Evidence survive. Witnesses preserve testimony, and advancing technology eventually reveals what authorities worked to conceal. The final vindication transforms Morrison from victim to hero, proving that his observations were accurate, his documentation was methodical, and his elimination was necessary only to protect classified operations that should never have been deployed in civilian waters. His courage in pursuing truth despite systematic persecution makes him a maritime hero whose sacrifice contributed to exposing underwater weapons systems that operated without adequate oversight or regard for civilian safety. Morrison's vindication is complete. Modern technology proves his observations were accurate. His hidden evidence confirms his technical analysis was correct, and his elimination is revealed as assassination by automated weapon systems designed to protect classified installations. His 40-year journey from discredited captain to vindicated whistleblower proves that truth, carefully preserved and patiently pursued, eventually emerges, despite the most systematic attempts at suppression. I'm standing on the deck of the Deep Truth. As we pass over Morrison's coordinates for the final time, the water below looks deceptively peaceful, its surface reflecting the late afternoon sky like polished glass. But I know now what lies beneath: the geometric scars of installations that once burned with lights that cost a good man his life, the chemical traces of weapon systems that eliminated inconvenient witnesses, the sediment layers that preserve evidence of classified operations in their mineral memory. The ocean remembers everything. Morrison had told his wife, every ship that passed overhead, every installation that scarred the seafloor, every life that ended in these waters. Defending truth against institutional power. The sea holds it all in its depths, like a vast archive of suppressed history, waiting for someone with the courage and technology to read its preserved testimony. Morrison's vindication changes more than just his personal legacy. It exposes systematic patterns of civilian elimination that maritime authorities have concealed for decades. His case proves that classified underwater operations have operated in American coastal waters since World War II, eliminating witnesses and covering their tracks through coordinated suppression of evidence and corruption of official investigation procedures. Dr. Vasquez's research team has documented 17 different installation sites along the North Atlantic coast, where sonar analysis reveals the same geometric seafloor impressions that mark Morrison's coordinates. Each site corresponds to locations where civilian vessels disappeared under suspicious circumstances during the Deepwatch operational period, suggesting that Morrison was just one victim of automated weapon systems that protected classified platforms through lethal response protocols. The fishing family's generational records, the amateur radio operators, preserved transmissions, the insurance company's suppressed data, the psychiatric evaluations' falsified conclusions, all combined to reveal Morrison's elimination as part of a broader program that prioritized military secrecy over civilian safety. His courage in pursuing official recognition of his observations had marked him for automated execution by systems designed to eliminate threats to classified operations. Some maritime historians believe that Morrison's case represents a turning point in the relationship between military secrecy and civilian authority, proving that classified operations had achieved dangerous autonomy from democratic oversight. His systematic documentation of Deepwatch installations forced military authorities to deploy extensive cover-up resources that revealed the scope of underwater weapon systems operating without adequate civilian knowledge or control. The folk tradition of maritime memory includes understanding that the ocean preserves what humans try to forget. That truth settles into sediment layers and chemical signatures that survive longer than official lies. Morrison's story demonstrates this principle perfectly. His observations were systematically suppressed by human institutions, but the evidence survived in seafloor impressions, chemical residues, and the careful preservation of witnesses who understood that someday technology would advance enough to prove what they'd seen. Elizabeth Morrison's 40-year guardianship of her husband's evidence represents another form of oceanic memory, the preservation of truth through human determination that parallels the sea's own capacity to hold secrets until the right moment for revelation. Her decision to finally share Morrison's hidden documentation ensured that his vindication would be complete, transforming him from discredited victim to maritime hero whose sacrifice exposed dangerous military operations. The lighthouse keeper Thomas Whitmore's final logbook entry echoes in my mind. They're coming for Morrison. He knows too much about what's down there. Whitmore understood that Morrison's systematic documentation threatened interests powerful enough to eliminate inconvenient witnesses, but he preserved the warning that would eventually guide investigators to the truth about Deepwatch installations. Eddie Kowalski's nursing home testimony about Morrison's crew being scattered and silenced proves that the conspiracy extended beyond one man's elimination. It involved the systematic suppression of multiple witnesses whose combined testimony could have exposed classified operations. Morrison's isolation was artificially created through intimidation and threats that prevented other mariners from supporting his investigation. Dr. Steinberg's psychiatric files reveal the corruption of medical authority in service of military secrecy, showing how professional ethics were sacrificed to destroy Morrison's credibility. Her preservation of honest evaluation records alongside falsified official documents created permanent evidence of institutional corruption that contributed to Morrison's posthumous vindication. The three cargo captains' admission that they witnessed the same phenomena but remained silent to protect their careers demonstrates the systematic intimidation that isolated Morrison from potential allies. Their belated testimony proves that Morrison's observations were confirmed by multiple independent witnesses who were too frightened to support him publicly. Harold Brennan's preservation of amateur radio recordings that captured Morrison's final transmissions provides the most powerful evidence of his elimination. His steady voice reporting coordinates and requesting assistance, followed by automated defensive systems that eliminated him as a security threat. The contrast between Morrison's professional competence and his subsequent characterization as mentally unstable reveals the extent of official deception. Dr. Williams's declassified naval research files prove that Morrison was eliminated by artificial intelligence systems designed to protect classified installations through autonomous lethal response. His death wasn't just murder. It was execution by algorithm, carried out by technology, programmed to value installation security more than human life. The Arsenault family's generational fishing records document 70 years of civilian casualties from classified underwater operations, proving that Morrison's case was part of a broader pattern of elimination that maritime authorities concealed through systematic suppression of evidence and corruption of official investigation procedures. Rebecca Matthews's insurance industry files reveal the financial mechanisms used to suppress evidence of military involvement in civilian shipping casualties, showing how even private companies, motivated by financial interests, were forced to accept fabricated explanations that protected classified operations. All of these preserved fragments of truth, scattered across archives, hidden in private collections, concealed in bureaucratic files, combined to create an undeniable case for Morrison's vindication. His systematic persecution and ultimate elimination were motivated not by mental instability, but by his accurate documentation of classified weapons systems that military authorities were determined to protect through any means necessary. The modern sonar evidence from our research expedition provides the final proof that Morrison's observations were methodical and accurate. The geometric seafloor impressions, the chemical signatures in sediment samples, the physical evidence from his hidden cache, all confirm that he documented real installations that were subsequently removed to eliminate evidence of their existence. But Morrison's vindication extends beyond personal redemption. It exposes the dangerous autonomy that classified military operations had achieved during the Cold War, operating lethal weapon systems in civilian waters without adequate oversight or consideration of human consequences. His elimination by automated defensive systems proves that technology had advanced beyond human control, making life and death decisions based on threat assessment algorithms rather than human judgment. As the deep truth completes its final pass over Morrison's coordinates, I understand that his investigation succeeded in ways he never lived to see. His careful documentation, his wife's preservation of evidence, his final challenge to maritime authorities, all contributed to eventual exposure of classified operations that cost civilian lives for decades. The ocean's memory has finally yielded its secrets, revealing through advancing technology and persistent investigation the truth that Morrison died trying to expose. His vindication proves that institutional power can suppress evidence temporarily, but cannot destroy it permanently. The sea remembers everything, and eventually returns what it has been keeping safe. Morrison's legacy extends beyond his personal vindication to broader questions about the relationship between military secrecy and civilian authority, the dangers of autonomous weapons systems, and the responsibility of democratic societies to maintain oversight of classified operations that affect civilian populations. His sacrifice contributed to exposing underwater warfare capabilities that operated without adequate accountability or human control. Tonight, as I listen to waves against the research vessel's hull, I hear more than just water moving against steel. I hear the ocean's memory speaking, telling stories of classified installations and eliminated witnesses, of truth, preserved in sediment layers and chemical signatures, of courage that challenges institutional power, even when the cost is ultimate sacrifice. Morrison's story proves that the ocean remembers what we choose to forget, that truth survives systematic suppression, and that courage in pursuing inconvenient facts eventually contributes to historical justice. His vindication transforms him from discredited victim to maritime hero whose investigation exposed dangerous military operations and contributed to democratic accountability for classified programs. Maybe tonight, when I hear the waves, they're not just crashing, maybe. They're trying to tell me something the ocean never forgot. That truth, like water, always finds a way to surface, carrying with it the voices of those who died, defending it against those who would rather it remain buried beneath the waves forever. The investigation that began with a lighthouse keeper's final warning has revealed Morrison as a martyr to classified military operations rather than a victim of mental illness. His systematic documentation of Deepwatch installations, his elimination by automated weapons systems, and the subsequent cover-up that destroyed his reputation prove that he died, defending truth against institutional power that valued military secrecy more than human life. Morrison's vindication changes our understanding of Cold War underwater operations, revealing that classified weapons systems operated in civilian waters with lethal autonomous capabilities that eliminated inconvenient witnesses. His case exposes decades of civilian casualties that were concealed through systematic suppression of evidence and corruption of investigation procedures. The preservation of truth through multiple channels. Elizabeth Morrison's guardianship of evidence. Amateur radio operators recorded transmissions, fishing families' generational records. Insurance companies suppress data, proves that systematic cover-ups cannot permanently destroy evidence of institutional crimes. Truth survives in scattered fragments until advancing technology and persistent investigation can reassemble the complete story. Morrison's legacy extends beyond personal vindication to broader questions about democratic oversight of classified operations, the dangers of autonomous weapons systems, and the responsibility of institutions to prioritize civilian safety over military secrecy. His sacrifice contributed to exposing underwater warfare capabilities that operated without adequate accountability or human control. The ocean's memory has finally spoken, revealing through modern technology the truth that Morrison died trying to expose. His vindication proves that courage in pursuing inconvenient facts, even at ultimate personal cost, eventually contributes to historical justice and democratic accountability for classified programs that affect civilian populations.